Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us online today. I'm delighted to be inviting you to this conversational debate presented by the South African Debate Initiative. My name is Dave Gilchrist. I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and I'm moderating today's debate. Just a reminder of the title. So the title of today's debate is, Who is the Real Jesus? The Qur'anic Isa or the Biblical Jesus? And I'd like to start by welcoming our speakers today. So let's begin on the Muslim side, starting off with Dr. Shabir Ali, based in Toronto, Canada. Good evening, Dr. Shabir.
Good to be here. Good evening to you all. Or good morning and good day to,
yes.
to you, according to where you are.
Thank you, Dr. Shabir. We're going to move on to Yusuf Ismail, based in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Good morning, Yusuf.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you, and good morning to the listeners and viewers out there. And good evening as well.
We appreciate you getting up so early for this debate. Thank you, Yusuf.
It's always a pleasure.
Moving on to the Christian side, starting off with Reverend Samuel Green, based in Australia. Good afternoon, Samuel.
Hello, Dave, and it's great to be with everyone today.
And moving on back to KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, welcome Rudolf Boshoff. We thank you too for getting up so early.
It's only a pleasure. Good to see you guys again.
Excellent. Let me begin by reviewing the structure of our debate today. So we will begin with opening statements of 15 minutes each. So it will be in the following order: Shabir, Samuel, Yusuf, and Rudolf. We'll then move into rebuttals of 7 minutes each, following the same order. We'll then have a time of cross-examination, 20 minutes, where Shabir and Yusuf ask Samuel and Rudolf, and then a further 20 minutes where Samuel and Rudolf are asking Shabir and Yusuf. And then we move into final arguments or concluding statements, which will be 4 minutes each. The order there will be Rudolf, then Yusuf, then Samuel, and finally Shabir. So without further ado, I would like to start the debate. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Shabir, as our first speaker for your opening statement of 15 minutes.
Well, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Rudolf and Samuel, for agreeing to be in this dialogue with Yusuf and I. Thank you, Yusuf, for inviting me to be your dialogue partner. And I'm so delighted to be with you and to be having this discussion along with the others we have been having, and we will continue to have more, God willing. I'm impressed, Rudolf, with the size of your library. May God continue to bless you and bless us all with guidance and with more and more knowledge, and help us to live according to the knowledge that he bestows upon us. As for our topic tonight, we have a lot of beliefs in Jesus in common between Muslims and Christians. The Quran and the Bible are in agreement that Jesus, on whom be peace, was a noble person, one of the greatest men who ever lived. The Quran refers to him as prophet and Messiah. The Quran shows that Jesus, on whom be peace, was born of Mary, whom Muslims affectionately remember as the Virgin Mary. The Quran shows that he performed many miraculous deeds according to the will and permission of God, that he even healed the blind and cured the leper. And the Quran says that God raised him to himself, which is interpreted by traditional Muslims as meaning that God took Jesus up bodily into heaven, and that eventually Jesus will come back another time upon the earth. So we see that Muslims and Christians do agree on a lot regarding Jesus. And outside of the Christian and Muslim faiths, I do not know of another faith that holds Jesus in such high regard as what I've just described. At the same time, there are differences, no doubt. Our Christian friends believe that Jesus is our Lord and Savior, and Muslims do not accept that. And so naturally, we need to iron out these points. So how can we decide which portrait of Jesus is the correct one? Is he a mere prophet, as the Quran seems to indicate, or is he a son of God and the divine savior? Naturally, a simple Christian response can be, you know what, the Bible is the word of God. Whatever it says, that's good enough for me. I don't need to probe any further. The Muslim can say likewise, the Quran is the word of God. Whatever it says, that is true. And I'll go with the Quranic portrait. But obviously, that doesn't settle anything. For us to be able to make headway tonight, I think we have to leave aside the question of which is the word of God for another event. And let's try to find some neutral ground on which we can measure the two portraits, the Quranic versus the biblical portrait of Jesus. So one neutral ground that comes to mind immediately is the historian's ground. Now, of course, historians are not gods, and historians have come up with a variety of different images of Jesus, anywhere from a cynic sage to an apocalyptic prophet, one who, according to some historians, would have failed. He thought that the world would end in his lifetime, but it didn't. So Muslims and Christians would hesitate to take such a view of Jesus because we believe, as a matter of faith, that Jesus was not a failure. He was the Messiah of God and successful, and God knows whom he chooses to be his prophets and his messiahs, not failures, but successes. But nonetheless, it is important for us to have some neutral ground. And so we can see that despite all of the different opinions that historians have arrived at, there are a few core items which are almost universally among historians accepted to be true. One is that Jesus was he was probably born in Palestine, but at least we see his activity in Palestine. In fact, I hesitated and I said probably, but let me take that as a certainty. They say that definitely Jesus was from Palestine. Second, that Jesus was a Jewish person. And third, that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptizer. And fourth, that Jesus was crucified under the Roman authority. So I think these are four facts which generally are accepted. Now, let me not go much into the first fact that Jesus was born in Palestine. This, I think, we have no issue with either as Muslims or Christians. But let's come to the other three facts then and look at them. Number one, that Jesus was a Jewish person. Number two, that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptizer. And three, that Jesus was crucified under the Roman authorities. Now, it is important for us to understand the historical methods and to see why they arrive at these particular facts. First of all, that Jesus was a Jewish person. This seems to be beyond dispute because wherever we read, we see that Jesus and his followers were working within that parameter, that they were Jews themselves and they're speaking to other Jews. There are questions about obedience to the law and so on. It is a totally Jewish context. Jesus was born therein and he was preaching in the same milieu. The second thing is that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptizer. Now, why do scholars take this as an indisputable fact? Because they see that in the New Testament, there are attempts to minimize this fact. There is, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, this interplay between Jesus and John the Baptizer. Everybody has been coming, confessing their sins, and John has been baptizing them. When Jesus comes, John says, "Oh, you've come to me. It is more appropriate that I should come to you." So what scholars understand from this interplay is that the Christians, after the fact, are in a way not comfortable with the idea that Jesus went to be baptized apparently for the forgiveness of his sins. So they want to minimize that fact. And the other Gospels can be analyzed in a similar way as well. And the conclusion is the same, that this seems to be an uncomfortable fact, and Christians would not have invented this had it not been true. They would not have reported it in the Gospels as they do. But not only are they reporting it in the Gospels, but they're trying to minimize it. So this seems to be the bedrock. The second indisputable fact that I want to look at is that Jesus was, or rather the last of these indisputable facts, where we're saying that he was Jewish, 2, that he was baptized, and 3, that he was crucified under Roman authority. Now, of course, a lot of lights would go up at this point, but by those Christians who have been trying to say to Muslims, "Oh, but your Quran is not historical." But we'll come to that. Let's understand the historian's method first. So the historian thinks that this also was an uncomfortable fact for Christians and the writers of the New Testament. And wherever we look, we see that there are attempts to smooth over this uncomfortable fact. So why would it have been an uncomfortable fact if Jesus was, as the Gospels portray him, he was the Messiah? That would mean that he had to enact God's kingdom here on earth. He had to sit on the Roman throne, having overthrown the Roman authorities. And the fact that he was crucified, this became an embarrassment because it looks like he didn't do what the Gospels were setting him up to do. And so it seems that the Christians would not have invented the idea that he was crucified under the Roman authorities unless it actually had happened. So we have then 3 facts that we can measure the 2 portraits against. 1, that Jesus was Jewish. 2, that he was baptized by the baptizer. And 3, that he was crucified under Roman authorities. I would want to now narrow down to even just 2 points, because the middle one, that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptizer, this does not seem to be such an important and significant point between Muslims and Christians. Although I would just add that in the Quranic stories about the birth of Jesus, both in the 3rd chapter of the Quran and the 19th chapter of the Quran, first the birth of John the Baptist is described, and a lot of good things are said about John the Baptist before we come to Jesus. So that shows that in the Quranic portrait as well, John the Baptist comes before Jesus, and he's an important figure, although the Quran does not press the link so much, except to show that Mary was under the care of Zechariah, who obviously is the father of Yahya, John the Baptist. Now, coming back to the last 2 remaining facts in this, I started out with 4. Now I'm down to 2. Okay, so these last 2, I believe, are very important and crucial. 1, that Jesus was Jewish, and 2, that he, according to the historians, was crucified. Now, as for the Jewishness of Jesus, this becomes very much lost in the New Testament writings, because the New Testament writings are written by people who have been influenced somewhat by Paul, who struggled with the law. And he can be interpreted in different ways, and there have been classical interpretations. There is also now a new perspective on Paul, which basically says that Paul actually thought that the law was still valid for Jews, but we should not impose that on non-Jews, and that Jews live in a covenantal relationship with God, based on which the Jewish people as a whole are going to be saved in the end. Something like this. It's a perspective that is still being discussed. But under some of the statements of Paul's letters, one would expect that Jesus wouldn't keep the law, and so this has been a long-standing Christian perception that at least Christians do not need to keep the law, whereas there are indications, even in the writings as they are now in the New Testament, that Jesus kept the law himself. And it was expected that his disciples will keep the law after him. In Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 15, for example, they even reach a decree, a conciliar decree, in which they will impose on even Gentiles that they're to keep certain aspects of the law, including some kosher laws. So the Quran, on the other hand, it seems to accept that Jesus was Rasulan ila Bani Israel. He was a messenger to the Bani Israel, and he said, I have come to confirm what remains in my presence of the Torah, and I am making permissible some of that which was previously impermissible for you. So it looks like the Quran scores well on this criterion of representing the Jewishness of Jesus. Coming to the last point for my last couple of minutes now, the crucifixion. Actually, the crucifixion turns out to be a double-edged sword, because if Jesus was, according to Christian theology, the divine Son of God, it's hard to see how he would have been crucified. Unless he is really engineering the whole thing to make sure that he will be crucified, in which case he will be suicidal. So I think this was a very crucial issue. And taking this a little bit further, to say that Jesus was crucified, like when the historians say that he was crucified as a fact, they're saying this based on the idea that Jesus was crucified for treason. This is from the Roman point of view. So all of this is very problematic for the idea that Jesus was the divine Son of God, but we'll expound upon that later. Lastly, I want to say that from the Muslim side, we do not need to conclude that the Quran is in error on this, because when the Quran is denying that Jesus was crucified, a traditional Muslim understanding is that someone else was made to look like Jesus and crucified instead. Now, of course, historians would balk at that idea. However, I believe that Yusuf and I are in agreement that we do not need to go that route. All we need to assert is that from the Quranic point of view, Jesus was not killed by the method of crucifixion. He may have been put on the cross, but taken down alive in a comatose state and revived, probably in the tomb from where God raised him into heaven, and he will come again. So on this view, we can actually agree with Christians on a large swath of what is related in the New Testament regarding this whole crucifixion matter. And not to say that the gospel should be taken at face value, but only for the point of advancing our dialogue, I would say that this idea that that Jesus came down from the cross alive and was taken up into heaven, this would explain a lot. For example, why the tomb was empty. It would also explain why the disciples saw Jesus, because God could have shown them a vision of Jesus in heaven to satisfy them that despite the doom and gloom of the moment, Jesus is actually alive and well, and that God has rescued him. And that would have empowered him to go forward and preach faith in Jesus as the Messiah. So that would explain the birth of the Christian mission. So altogether then, to sum up, I've narrowed down to two historical facts of wide agreement: that Jesus was a Jewish person. That's well represented in the Quran, not so in the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. And two, that Jesus was crucified. I've seen that the Quran explains that well. And the Christian theology more generally, but the New Testament writings in particular, would be hard-pressed to make theological sense of this fact that Jesus was crucified. In fact, this is one of the reasons why the historians think that this was one of the bedrock facts, because the New Testament writings are struggling to make sense of that. So I rest my case, and I'd like to hear your responses, and I'll come back with more, God willing.
Thank you, Dr. Shabir. Right on 15 minutes. Thank you for that. We're going to move straight into our second speaker. So over to you, Reverend Samuel, for your 15 minutes, and I'll bring up your slides now. And I think, Samuel, you're on mute, I think.
Well, it's great to be with everyone again for this important discussion. And it is an important discussion because how we understand Jesus according to the Bible really matters, and what he's done for us. There are, of course, different views of Jesus in the world. There's the Christian view, there's the Muslim view, there's the Baha'i view, there's the secular historian view. There are different views that are out there. But today we're particularly looking at the Christian and the Muslim one. And I'm going to be outlining why Christians believe that the Christian perspective from the Bible is in fact the true one. So I want to look at the eyewitnesses, the earliest documents that the Bible, that Jesus' life in the New Testament confirms the Old Testament, the previous scriptures. I want to look at theological development, and if we can use that for dating. The Bible is confirmed by history, and the Bible is confirmed by the Quran. So a few points there. I'm just going to touch on each of these quite quickly. So let's look at the first one. First of all, when Jesus came, he deliberately chose disciples to be with him so that they could be his witnesses. So he appointed 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. So Jesus' mission was not just for him alone to be here, but to have his disciples, something the Quran would agree with, and that they were to be with him, and that they, as a result, would be witnesses for him. And we read about their witness in verses like this: that which was from the beginning, so it's speaking about Jesus here, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. So the New Testament makes it clear that these disciples are eyewitnesses, and that this is where the New Testament finds its origin in their witness. This is actually fulfilling Israel's mission to be God's witness in this world. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, from Isaiah. And so Jesus in his mission is actually bringing Israel's mission to its fulfillment in having the disciples to be witnesses for him. And so we read, you apostles will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so what we see here is that we've got multiple witnesses to Jesus' life from these apostles. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John with their testimonies behind them. We've got the apostle Paul, James, John, Jude. So we've got a number of people giving their testimony to Jesus. And it makes it clear here that they've been given the Holy Spirit to be empowered to do this. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on that. I'm going to, like Shabir, look at it from a historical point of view, but I do want to point out that there is that spirit inspiration aspect to it. Now, very often the idea of authorship comes up, where people will challenge the authorship of the New Testament. And I'm just going to briefly touch on this because we might do it more in our discussion. But often this is done with the fallacy of equivalence, where people will say the Gospels are anonymous, but anonymous does not mean unknown. That's a different idea. And so the apostles were known to the churches that they started. And when we read the early church, there is never any discussion as to who the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually are. The names of all of these people, of these authors, are actually on all the texts that are extant and in the titles. And there's simply no evidence for these authors being unknown. I will just go down. So some people might say, well, the names were just invented and added on later. However, the early church fathers discuss this, for instance, with the book of Hebrews, where there's no name given there, and they don't invent a name. So that there's never been a name invented and stuck on the book of Hebrews. So they didn't invent names. And so if you want to say that the authorship is unknown, you actually need to present some evidence. Let's keep going. The other thing about the documents in the New Testament, which testify to Jesus' life, is that they are the earliest. So they're from multiple eyewitnesses, and they are the earliest. We've got letters from the Apostle Paul from the year AD 50 onwards. But interestingly, with the gospel, why we can't date them exactly, we can actually know a fair bit about them, because when we read the letters of the Apostle Paul, he actually quotes the exact same material that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you dig into this, you'll see that he's got this from the testimony of the Jerusalem church. We see this in Acts 13. But what we see there is Paul quotes what the material and the story, the narrative that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke of Jesus' life. He quotes it in his letters. And when he quotes it, it's quoted verbatim. And so this shows that this teaching and this story of Jesus was in a fixed form by the time Paul is writing his letters, in fact, he's saying that this is what he gave them beforehand. So when we do the maths on this, we can see that the teaching of Jesus and the story of his life was in a fixed form being used for teaching in the church no later than 17 years after Jesus. And so the material that we find that ends up in the Gospels can be dated very, very early. So it's from the eyewitnesses. There's multiple eyewitnesses, and it's incredibly early. Now, it also confirms the previous scriptures. Again, this is a whole debate within itself, and so this is something we might discuss. But the idea that there is a sacrifice of atonement to bring you to God, the idea of the temple, that God comes to dwell with his people and so is present with his people. We see that with Adam. We see that in the temple. We see that promised in the prophets, that God will come to dwell with his people. And so this is the grounds for the incarnation, that God has come to dwell with his people. The idea of the divine Son of Man is there in the Old Testament. The idea of the resurrection from the dead, and the Messiah bringing this resurrection kingdom is there. And so when we look at the gospel, the story that we have of Jesus in the New Testament, it confirms what we have in the Old Testament. And that's why Christians have that in the Bible and why we read all of these prophets. Now, we actually see this particularly, and I want to look at the Jewish scholar Daniel Boyarin, because he brings up some interesting points here, and this has got to do with theological development. We often think that the story of Jesus developed over time. I know Bart Ehrman has him as an apocalyptic prophet who then develops in time to become a man. But Daniel Boyarin is a Jewish scholar, and he's prepared to admit that in the time before Jesus, the high Christology was already developed. So let me just read it to you. Most, if not all, of the ideas and practices of the Jesus movement of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd and even later can be safely understood as part of the ideas and practices that we understand to be Judaism of this period. The ideas of the Trinity and incarnation, or certainly the germs of those ideas, were already present in Jewish believers well before Jesus came on the scene to incarnate in himself, as it were, those theological notions and take up his messianic calling. And then again, it's frequently been asserted that low Christologies are Jewish ones, while high Christologies have come into Christianity from the Greek thought world. I submit that it is possible to understand the Gospels only if Jesus and the Jews around him held to a high Christology, whereby the claim to messiahship was also a claim to being a divine man. So I recommend this book to people because he takes you through the books, the Jewish books of Enoch and 4th Ezra's, where we actually see high Christologies pre-Jesus. And so this idea that we can map out a time frame from Jesus just being a man to a high Christology, showing that it's divorced now from history, is actually not sustainable. It's not sustainable. Now, the Bible is also confirmed by general history, by documents outside of the Bible. So we read this here. We read of Lucian, of Samosata, of Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Mara bar Serapon, and the Talmud, and Josephus. And all of these refer to Jesus in different ways, and they confirm to what we have in the Bible. And so what we just see here is that the Bible fits into this general history. I'm not going to read the Josephus quote now for time, but we might come back to it. But I'd like to just quote from E.P. Sanders. And he says, I shall first offer a list of statements about Jesus that meet two standards. They are almost beyond dispute, and they belong to the framework of his life, and especially his public career. And then he lists out where he was born, the time, baptized by John, having disciples, his message, the Passover, creating a disturbance in the temple, his final meal, arrested, and his crucifixion. But my point simply here is that these historians use the New Testament, and they're not ashamed to use the New Testament, and they take that framework for understanding Jesus' life. I want to finish up with my final point now by looking at how the Bible and its testimony, which by inference has its testimony to Jesus, is confirmed by the Quran. We read verses like this: "So let the people of the gospel judge according to what Allah revealed in it. Those who do not judge according to what Allah revealed are the sinners." And so here we have the Quran actually calling upon Christians to judge according to their scriptures. In this case, calling us the people of the gospel, which is what we are. We know historically the types of people who were around Muhammad and what their scriptures were, that they were Byzantines down in Yemen. Muhammad had contact up into Syria, Egypt, across into Ethiopia. And we know the scriptures of these Christians. We know the gospel story that contains. So here we have the Quran saying to Christians, and giving an acceptance of the story that comes from their scriptures. Finally, and this is just from Ibn Ishaq's Sirah of Muhammad's life, but it's interesting here that it has a reference to the Gospel of John. And so we read here, "Among the things which have reached me about what Jesus, the son of Mary, stated in the Gospel which he received from God for the followers of the Gospel, in applying a term to describe the apostle of God, is the following. It is extracted from what John the apostle set down for them when he wrote the gospel for them from the testament of Jesus, son of Mary." And the point I just want to bring up here is that he specifically refers to John's gospel, and it goes on to quote from John 14. But my point here is that this is from the earliest biography, the extant biography that we have of Muhammad's life. And what is it doing? It's identifying the Gospel of John as a true representation of Jesus' life. So again, this is broader writings within Islam confirming that the Bible has the truth about Jesus. So in conclusion, which book has the truth about Jesus? Well, I want to say, I'm just presenting the biblical view and defining it at this stage. I want to say the Bible has the truth about Jesus because it has the eyewitnesses that he called and commissioned to witness to his life and to pass on his message. It has by far the earliest documents. As I said, we can even date some of the quotes to within 17 years of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. It confirms the earlier scriptures, and so we have that continuity there. There is no theological development by which we can say, well, this came later and so they're not true history. The Bible is actually confirmed by history. It fits into that framework and historians use it as a historical document. And finally, it's confirmed by the Quran and the Sirah, which call upon Christians to follow their scriptures and by inference what it says about Jesus, and the Sirah, which explicitly mentions the Gospel of John, which again is the Christian position that we would be inviting people to find out about. And so to conclude, I'd want to say, if you want to know the truth about Jesus, then read the Bible, read the Gospel accounts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Samuel. We're going to move straight on to Yusuf for 15 minutes. Before you start, Yusuf, I'm just going to take Samuel's slides down. So Yusuf, over to you for your opening statement of 15 minutes.
Well, thank you to everybody. And it's great again to be back with friends. So I just want to start off with something on this particular subject, that we're talking about Jesus both from the context of the the New Testament and of course the Quran. Let me just get my plug in. The one thing we need to know is the psychology. The authors of the New Testament wrote in a time and place in which people had, of course, adopted not only the language but also the ideas of their conquerors. They spoke Greek, they thought like the Greeks. And if you look at the scholarly consensus, people like Fredrickson, Hopkins, Giza Vermesh, and so on and so forth, they write that the idea of the authors was to purge the notion of anything Jewish, that was not easily compatible with Greek thought. And in fact, to explain themselves using non-Jewish Greek ideas that their listeners and readers would find comprehensible. Now, so some would make the argument that you have that earlier on, the stories about Christ quickly became vehicles of abstract doctrines based or model on Greek philosophy and indeed Greek religion. Now, I've got an interesting book here. This is by Craig Blomberg. Blomberg's a conservative. He's from the University of Aberdeen, a professor at Denver Seminary. And in his book, Can We Still Believe in God? In the chapter called Weren't the Stories of Jesus Made Up from Greco-Roman Myths? He makes an interesting point in his conclusion, and this is what he says, to quote him: there are probably places where one or more of the New Testament gospel writers drew on certain aspects of the way Greeks and Romans tended to tell their stories about Jesus, about their legendary heroes. It is even likely that Jesus was aware of what forms the lives of sages in his world took, and in places deliberately conformed to those models. So here he's attempting to rebut the position that the stories of Jesus were made up from Greek and Roman myths. But he hypothecates that there's a likelihood that there's a modeling around these particular heroes. And he goes on to say, what keeps them from playing too large a role, meaning these parallels, when they're most likely described accurately, is a whole host of very Jewish parallels we have throughout all four Gospels. So he doesn't discount the idea that there are parallels in Greco-Roman mythology, and even hypothecates and plays around the idea that the authors are probably drawing around these particular legendary sources when they develop this. But he makes the point that there's a sort of self-awareness in relation to this. This is no less a scholar like Craig Blomberg, and he, interestingly enough, makes that interesting observation. Now, if you look at the gospel stories, you find that there are variations, but the variations sometimes reflect the different theological aims of the audiences and literary styles. For example, if you look at Matthew describes Jesus as someone who is a miracle-working Messiah, understanding the law. Mark basically speaks about Jesus constantly having this identity crisis, and keeping his identity secret. Luke presents him as a sort of divine man with supernatural births and speaks about his birth. And it's only John's gospel that you have a portrait where, Jesus is presented as this kind of pre-existent divine being. So when you, for example, look at the divinity of Christ, John's gospel portrays him as a pre-existent divine being, whereas the others less so. Now this can be practically demonstrated in relation to when you look and comb the scriptures itself. Shabir Ali, for example, in the past, I know Samuel alluded to Bart Ehrman, but Shabir Ali in past debate, and I've used this many times in debate, cited two particular scholars, Richard Borkham and the late F.F. Bruce. And both Bruce and Borkham basically hold the view that Matthew and Luke base their gospels on the Gospel of Mark. Bruce, of course, holds that Matthew and Luke made stylistic improvements to the narratives which are found in Mark's gospel. So, for example, he gives one telling point in Mark 13:35. As an example, Jesus refers to himself as a master of the house. In Matthew 24, he refers to himself as your Lord. Now, it's quite clear that when you even look at the Greek itself, and I'm not an expert in Greek, you can find the distinction so apparent. So, for example, in Mark 8:29, Peter calls Jesus the Messiah. I think if you look at the Greek, just forgive my pronunciation, kai autos eperota, autos haimes, detinami, legete enai, apokrotes, ho Petros lege autose I, ho Christos. So he describes himself as a Messiah. But in Matthew 16:16, he adds a point where he says, se I ho Christos, ho huios, to theo to zontos, the Messiah, son of the living God. There's clearly a distinction. There's clearly an improvement. The same thing, for example, in Mark 3:31, where Jesus refers to God as God, but there's a personalization in Matthew 12:46, where he calls himself my Father. The story of the drowning at sea in Mark, in Mark, the disciples are rebuking Christ and they say, teacher, don't you care that we are perishing? But in Matthew, the disciples tell him, and they use the word interestingly in Greek, they say, kairi soson apolymitha. Kairi soson apolymitha, Lord save us, we are perishing. So there's a distinction between the two. And when you even analyze the Greek, it's quite clear that someone is attempting to make a stylistic improvement in relation to this. You have, for example, a reduction in the distinction between Jesus and God. So in Mark 10:18, Jesus basically tells his disciples, when they tell him, good master, what good should I do to enter eternal life? So he says, Timi lege agathon, odios agathos, aimi hais hothios. Hothios, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. Whereas in Matthew 19:17, that aspect about hothios is totally removed. There's only one who is good. Why do you ask of who is good? So in Matthew, Jesus doesn't repudiate the attribution of goodness to himself as he did in Mark, where he says it's reserved for the whole theos. And then lastly, you have a particular passage in relation to the human limitations of Christ, the story of the fig tree, where Jesus said to the tree, he goes, he sees no figs, may no fruit come from you, and the tree withers and dies. Matthew, the latest gospel, states he was hungry, and he sees the fig tree dries. He says, may no fruit ever come from you again, and the tree withered, which is not to be found in Mark's gospel. Now, Matthew didn't mention that it was not the season of figs, which Mark mentioned, which gave the indication that there was some sort of ignorance. Now, some Christians would try and downplay this incident by saying that, look, the entire narrative is used as a parable to show how those who refuse to bear fruit will be dealt with. But that's not the whole point. The point is that by mentioning the fact that it was not the season of figs, Mark shows specifically that Jesus' knowledge was limited, regardless of whether there was a parable, whether this could be used as a parable or not. There's clearly an issue that has to be explained here. So when you look from it, Shabir Ali has mentioned this numerous in debates. I've used some of his material, which is, of course, used, and the scholarly consensus on that particular point is that the image of Christ has been improved from one gospel to another. So, for example, in Mark, on the night before the crucifixion, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus asks his Father to let this cup pass away from me. But in John's gospel, you see the fact that Jesus is not shown to be praying in the way on that occasion. In fact, even before the event, he's already declared he will not pray like that. Because at the beginning, you see that John the Baptist has declared that Jesus is already the sacrificial lamb. So there's a different portrayal in relation to how Jesus is in fact presented, based, of course, on the gospels that were basically being written. Then, of course, you've got historical distinctions and problems that you arrive. For example, in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. But according to Luke, Jesus would be born during the first census in Israel, the census conducted, when Quirinius was governor of Syria. But that's impossible because according to, in March, the Herod died in about March 4 BC, and the census took place in the year 6 or 7 years after the birth of Christ, about 10 years after Herod's death. So how do we explain that? What about the genealogies? Matthew and Luke disagree. They give two different genealogies, and Christian apologists try to suggest that one is actually Mary's, even though Luke says it explicitly Joseph, and Matthew says Joseph. How do you reconcile these two particular genealogies? How do you reconcile them? You can't reconcile them. We're not going to go into the details, but it's clear that there are problems that you essentially have. I mean, both the genealogies show that Joseph was a direct descendant of David. But if Joseph is not Jesus' father, then Joseph's genealogy would be meaningless insofar as Jesus is in fact concerned. So one has to wonder why Matthew and Luke in fact include them. Well, why do they in fact include them? And so these are problems that you effectively have. Long after Matthew and Luke wrote the genealogies, the church invented, or I would say probably came up with the idea of the virgin birth and tried to effectively break the physical link between Joseph and Jesus in relation to that. The other problem is, why do only Matthew and Luke mention the story of the virgin birth? Why do none of the other gospels, in fact, mention them? Why do Matthew include 4 women in Jesus' genealogy? Why would they include them? To have women in the genealogy is very unusual, and women of sexual impropriety is highly problematic. The only reason is that can make any kind of sense is that Joseph, rather than the Holy Spirit, according to the gospel narratives, impregnated Mary, and that this was not known by others who argued that because of this, Jesus could not be the Messiah. So by mentioning the women, the Messiah, who must have been the descendant of King David, will at least have 4 so-called loose women in the genealogy. So what difference does one make? That's the only implication one can get. And there are many passages like this. I mean, for example, I know time is limited, but if you look, for example, at the crucifixion, they mentioned Jesus being crucified between 2 robbers. We know that crucifixion was reserved for insurrectionists, rebellious slaves. If we look at the resurrection, for example, who found the empty tomb? If you look at each gospel, you find a different answer. Who did they find at the tomb? When you look at each gospel, there's a different answer. What did the woman say about the tomb? Again, the gospel accounts give us different arguments, different positions, different perspectives in relation to what happens. Now, when you contrast that to the Quran, the Quranic narrative about Jesus is not spectacular. There are no spectacular claims made about Christ. He's fundamentally presented as a prophet. So, for example, in Surah 2, verse 87, it says, we gave Jesus, the son of Mary, clear signs, strengthen him with the Spirit, with the Holy Spirit, with the Archangel Gabriel. To Jesus, the son of Mary, gave clear signs. Or, O Mary, God gives thee glad tidings of a word from him. He shall speak to the people in childhood and maturity. He shall be in the company of the righteous. In Surah 5, verse 46, we sent Jesus, son of Mary, confirming the law that had come before him. We sent him the gospel. Therein was guidance and light and confirmation of the law. They do blaspheme who say God is Christ, the son of Mary. But said Christ, O children of Israel, worship God, my Lord and your Lord. Whoever joins other gods with God, God will forbid him the garden, and the fire will be his abode. Christ, the son of Mary, in 575, was no more than a messenger. Many were the messengers that passed before him. His mother was a woman of truth. They both ate their daily food. So the Quranic narrative of Christ is not spectacular, in other words, where you would have to basically waive your rationality and then enter the realm of imagination and fancy, where you've got this kind of superhero kind of characteristic. If I were to tell you that Superman lives down the road, it's going to be unbelievable. Nobody's going to believe that there's a superhero down my road. That's going to be difficult to understand. But if I say, look, I've got a neighbor, he's working an 8 to 5 job as usual, he has kids and so on, that's believable. That's essentially the Quranic narrative of Jesus, that he's a man, a human being like us. He's a prophet of God. He's a mighty messenger of God, one of the mightiest messengers of God. He was vouchsafed revelation. He came to confirm the gospel, the Torah. And essentially, anyone who views him in any divine sense is in fact mistaken. The only real distinction or problem that you could basically have from a Christian point of view is that it essentially denies the crucifixion. But it denies it more particularly on theological grounds, on the idea directly taking a corrective approach from the position that someone could be killed and thereby, as a result of their death, they could be a sacrifice which would result in the atonement of humanity with regards to its sins. So he's not a sacrificial lamb in the sense of dying for and on behalf of the sins of humanity or the sins of the elect or the sins of mankind. But there's nothing spectacular which you could say that, look, this is a description which is not accurate. So, for example, in Surah 5, verse 114, you basically have the passage that did God tells Jesus, and I'm going to end on this point, did you tell men worship me and my mother as gods in derogation of God? Jesus will say, glory be to you. Never could I say what I had no right to say. Nothing along that line. So in conclusion, I would make the argument that the Quranic point of view is far more reasonable, far more grounded, far more rational, as opposed to the biblical New Testament narrative, which seems to have this kind of evolutionary approach and which seems to be based in large part, to a certain extent, on the idiosyncrasies and nuances of the Greco-Roman society of that particular time. And so I'd leave this discussion on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Yusuf. We're going to move on to Rudolph's opening statement of 15 minutes. So Rudolph, I'll hand over to you and make sure that your slides are up as well.
Well, thank you so much, friends. Thank you so much once more for having this discussion. And it's always a pleasure to discuss, things pertaining to specifically faith with these gentlemen. So I think Samuel addressed and presented the biblical account as a basis for what we can know about Jesus that aligns pretty much with the biblical and historical data. So I will outline 4 points that address key assumptions about Christ, and I will try to demonstrate why we can confidently affirm that the biblical portrait of Jesus is not only the earliest, but also the most reliable account of who he was and what he said. What I will do is I will contrast it with the claims of the Quran and show why it's rather the biblical Jesus, not the Isa of the Quran, who is certain. So my first point will therefore begin by examining the Quranic portrayal of Jesus and identify some of the key problems that we have with it. So the Quran, compiled in the earlier century, over 6 centuries after the life of Jesus, draws upon some traditions, some oral, some later interpretive developments, rather than what we know to be the first century eyewitnesses or the Gospels. And like Samuel showed, by contrast, the canonical Gospels are rooted in early historical sources, including historical traditions in the Pauline corpus, some creedal materials that we can observe in 1 Corinthians that is shown, and so forth. But let me just say that when we look, for instance, at the Gospel accounts, we can show that and see that these sources consistently attest to what is historically reliable. For instance, in the crucifixion, all Gospels include a crucifixion narratives. That is very important. Some of Christ's divine claims, probably Mark, which is deemed to be the earliest, if you hold to a Markian priority view, would deem Christ to be spoken of in very high claims, I would suggest. And then obviously, as Shabir mentioned, when we look at the crucifixion and the resurrection, all of these things are very early attested, especially in one of the earlier creedal forms by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. But we should ask also the contrary question. What about the Quran? Because the Quran denies these 3 elements that I've just mentioned, presenting, as Yusuf now just said, Jesus is a human prophet. And we can see quite clearly that the Quran mentions in Al-Ma'idah, it's chapter 575, that it calls Jesus just the Messiah, the son of Mary, who was just only a messenger. So regarding the crucifixion, let me just say, if we look for any source material, if we want to relate the crucifixion narrative that we see in the Quran with anything, we find that it's close approximated to the 2nd century Gnostic influences, like, for instance, Basilides and his substitutionary theory, rather than the actual historical gospel and the actual historical events. Now, Basilides was an early Gnostic who claimed that his teachings were derived from the Apostle Matthias, but we can see quite clearly that the Quran clearly aligns itself with early Gnostic tendencies concerning the crucifixion of Christ. Even when it tries to refute the divine claims of Christ, we can see quite clearly, for instance, in chapter 2, 116, 18, verse 4, and then also in the Quran, chapter 6, 101, where it refers to Jesus as the Son of God. We can see quite clearly that the idea of procreation is what is presented against why Christians should hold to a notion of the divinity of Christ. Well, this again does not speak directly to what early Orthodox Christians believe, but rather what Arian heretical views constituted in the 3rd and the 4th centuries. So my understanding of what the source material would be like is that the author of the Quran appears to contend rather with an early Arian assumption about Jesus rather than a biblical one. And then also, like I've mentioned with the crucifixion, when we look at the crucifixion event, we can see quite clearly that it seems to lean very much on some of the similarities which is found in the Acts of John, which is again a Gnostic writing. And there's work done by Edgar Heinecke in his New Testament Apocrypha, Volume 2, page 232, that demonstrates that this heresy was widespread, and the essentials of this heresy appears in passages like Al-Nisa, chapter 4, 157, 158. So what is the historical qualm that I've got with the Quran and the reading of it? Well, when we look at the Quran, it seems like the Quran modified some of the early Gnostic tales, somewhat incorporating them in themes of rapture, likeness, and even substitution, which leads us to believe that the Quranic alternative is based on folklore, early Gnostic docetism, and other apocryphal sources rather than the original historical records of Jesus. John Gilchrist, in his wonderful books that he's written on the Quran and historical Jesus and Jesus Disfigured, it's been out for a while, he sums it up beautifully. He says the following. He says, the problem with the Quranic records, especially when it comes to Christ, is that they repeat these legends alongside historical material and claim that the finished product is divine revelation of Allah himself. Many of the Quranic narratives mix up biblical material with folklore and legendary myths found in the Midrash and other Gnostic material known to the Jewish world throughout the past millennia, and we know those to be imaginary and fictitious. Secondly, my second point, another problem concerns itself with the miracles of Christ that is described in the Quran. And this is just something that I've picked up recently and really want to look at. The Quran obviously attributes to Jesus miracles that encroach on God's exclusive domain of creation, such as animating clay birds in chapter 349 and 510 is mentioned again. And again, Richard Balcom was mentioned. So let me tell you what Richard Balcom said. He highlights that the core of Judaism was the very central belief that God was the sole creator and the sole ruler. What is then enacted in early Gnostic writings and later adopted with what we can see in the Quran echoes what we see in Genesis 2 verse 7, in which God alone forms humanity from dust and breathes life into it. Now, the problem with this is that in Jewish theology, such acts would violate the Shema and the absolute monotheism, because only Yahweh creates ex nihilo, or imparts life, according to Isaiah 42:5 and 24. So the biblical Jesus performs miracles like healing the blind, John 9, raising Lazarus, John 11, through divine authority as the perfect man, but there is never independent creative acts like what we see described in the Quran. So the biblical Jesus seems to constantly invoke the Father whilst serving in his ministry here on earth. We see that, for instance, in John chapter 5. But creative miracles in the Jewish milieu is solely constituted by God alone. So by the Quran just giving Jesus creative power, we agree by God's permission. We can see that the Quran also has a flaw when it speaks of this instance with Jesus, because the Quran inadvertently blurs the line between prophet and creator, risking shirk and violating what is known as strict monotheism in a Jewish sense. So again, this is something that should be highlighted. What is also striking is that when we look at the story of Jesus animating and creating birds, it should be noted that, again, it leans wholly on apocryphal text that is found in the 2nd century. For instance, in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, chapter 2, where the child Jesus animates clay birds in a playful act, which suggests that the Quran incorporates late non-historical legends that elevate Jesus beyond the mere messenger. And that is exactly what John Gilchrist actually noticed. So for my third point, now what about the Quranic Jesus in his relation to the early Jewish expectation? So when we look at the Quran rejects an Islamic framework onto Jesus, claiming that his followers were Muslims, submitting themselves to God, according to Ali Imran, that's chapter 352, and Asaf, chapter 61:6. Yet the historical Jesus, as a 1st century Galilean Jew, proclaims the kingdom of God within a Jewish eschatology, according to Mark 1. He fulfills the Torah prophecies, according to Matthew 5:17. His teachings emphasize Sabbath observance, according to Mark chapter 2:27. He cleanses he upholds the temple purity, according to John 2:13-22, and he exceeds the messianic hopes from Isaiah 61, with no trace in any of this to the ritualistic aspects of ancient Arabia or anything that we find in the practices of devotion when it comes to Islam. There's no salat, there's no formal prayer, there's no psalm, there's no fasting during Ramadan, to mention just a few things. So what is the historical flaw when we look at the Quran and its assumptions about Jesus? Is that the post-resurrection Jesus and his disciples remained Torah-observing Jews. You can read that in Acts chapter 21, 22-24. And they eventually evolved into a messianic sect without adopting Islamic practices. I think another interesting point noted by Samuel is that when we look at the depiction of the work and life and the milieu of Jesus, we can see that there is no temple Judaism in relation to these Quranic practices. So even if we look at these instances, if we look at prophecies about Ahmad in the Songs of Solomon, Deuteronomy, and similar texts, we can see again that they lack first century attestation when it's mentioned in the Qurans. And we can see that the demands that is placed that there's another prophet to come that is to come is absent in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, and other revelational documents. So that is very important to keep in mind as well when we look at the Jesus of the Quran and measure him towards history and the biblical imperatives. For my final point, in my last 4 minutes, I will examine the depiction of the biblical events and figures, including some anachronisms, omissions, and elements foreign to the historical teaching, and what the problems is, especially when it looks at the Isa of the Quran. Now, let me just start off and say that the Quran, while presenting Jesus as a prophet, as we just heard, it still incorporates details that conflate him with earlier biblical figures, and it omits core aspects of his ministry and documents that is documented in the first centuries. And it, again, retrojects 7th century Islamic conceptions such as jihad onto his legacy, none of those which aligns with the historical evidence. So let me show you what I mean, because scholars widely regard the Quran just as lacking an independent value for reconstructing the historical Jesus, and they view it instead as a derivative of late antiquity and traditions, and apocrypha rather than actual eyewitness accounts. So let me show how this historical and theological flaws affect what we can believe about Jesus and how it's void in the biblical text. One of the key historical flaws in the Quran, for instance, confuses Mary. The Quran identifies Mary, mother of Jesus, as the sister of Aaron in chapter 19:28, and as the daughter of Imran in chapter 3:35 and 36. Conflating her with Miriam, sister of Moses and Aaron in Exodus 15 and Numbers 26, who lived more than 1,400 years earlier. So this is an anachronism that suggests a confusion of the historical data. So like I've mentioned as well, is when we look at the Jesus of the Quran, we can see that there are absence of key ministry elements. So unlike the Gospels, which detail Jesus' use of parables in Mark chapter 4, and in fact, there's about 40 recorded parables, some of his exorcisms in Mark 5, Luke 4, some of his temple actions like we see in John chapter 2, that is obviously prefigured in Jeremiah 7:11, geographic locations like Galilee, Capernaum, Jerusalem. The Quran omits all of these entirely, reducing Jesus simply to a miracle worker with no context to Jewish ministry or actual historical Jewish imperatives. Again, when it speaks of salvation, we can see quite clearly that the Jesus of the Bible does not mention anything that comes from the Quranic frame of salvation. The Quranic frame of salvation includes that there's salvation through jihad and martyrdom for paradise, which extends this military ethos to Jesus in the end time role when it speaks of him. Yet the historical Jesus never taught violence. In actual fact, when we look at the biblical imperative, we can see that Jesus teaches imperatives like turn the other cheek, love your enemies in Matthew chapter 5. And we can see that there's a mention of the entry into the kingdom through repentance and faith, according to Mark 1:15 and John 3:16. Not any armed or devotional struggle, as the author of the Quran would have us believe. So the Quran applies its own doctrine of salvation through jihad. It even mentions that the followers of Jesus in the end time roles, and this is specifically in the Hadith, will wage war, kill Dajjal, and enforce Islam. This is irreconcilable, like I said, with the historical Jesus, who is explicitly rejecting any form of violent resistance. He even speaks and he says in Matthew 5, all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. John 18, he says that my kingdom is not of this world, my servants will not fight. So we can see over and over again, no first century source, Christian, Jewish, or pagan, depicts Jesus and his disciples as promoting any form of war. There's no independent historical insight into the fact that Jesus can be verified by what is seen in the Quran. And let me give you a quote in closing of Bartley Ehrman, who speaks of the historical elements that is lacking in the Quran. He says, I do not think that the Quran has any particular insight about the historical Jesus that are to be taken as independent reports by historical scholars. Neither does any historical scholar that I know, or anyone who works seriously on the historical Jesus. So in conclusion, when we look at the understanding the two portraits laid side by side, the biblical Jesus that is found on the ground of evidence of the first century evidence and the Isa of the Quran, they're vastly different. And let me just say, the one is historical and sure, and the other one is not. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Rudolph. Break down your slides. We're going to move now into a time of rebuttals, which will be 7 minutes each, and we will follow the same order as we did in terms of opening statements. So I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Shabir, for your rebuttal of 7 minutes. You'll just need to go off mute.
Am I audible now?
Yes, all good.
Okay. So, gentlemen, it was great listening to you all, to Samuel, Yusuf, and Rudolph. So here are my comments. I think you all spoke very well. I agree with much of what you said, but here are some comments. So let me refresh your memory about what my main points were. That I narrowed down to two basic historical facts that are widely agreed among historians. These are neutral people. They're neither necessarily Christians nor Muslims, but they agree that Jesus was Jewish, and two, that he was crucified under the Roman authorities. Now, I've shown that the Quran preserved the Jewishness of Jesus, whereas the Bible does not actually do that very well. And I will expound upon that a little bit more in response to your points. Second, the idea that he was crucified under Roman authorities, this goes against the idea that this was a divine being from out of heaven as represented in John's Gospel, in the writings of Paul. Now, whereas I started with the point of view of neutral historians and then tried to compare the two portraits, the Bible and the Quran, with the neutral historical portrait, I find that the Christian presenters tend to say, okay, well, the Bible already said this, that's the true history, that's how Jesus was, the Quran is different from the Bible, therefore the Quran must be wrong. The Quran must be following the Basilidians, or as Rudolph was saying, or, Gnosticism more generally, or apocryphal stories. So I think we need to have our eye on the ball here. What is the real Jesus? So there was a real Jesus who walked on the ground. Then there are historical reconstructions of Jesus, many different, with different features. And we said we cannot go with all of those different historians since they disagree among themselves. But there are certain basic historical facts that they agree on. Now, when they narrow down to these historical facts, as Reverend Samuel pointed out, he even mentioned E.P. Sanders in his book, The Historical Figure of Jesus. Here are the facts that are narrowed down. Now, you won't find in those facts, Samuel, that Jesus is the divine Son of God who came down from heaven here upon earth. No. So you cannot have your cake and eat it too. You cannot say, okay, let's go by the historians. The Quran must be on historical. And then you bring in all the things which the historians have already rejected from the New Testament records. Samuel, for example, said, look, Jesus fulfilled all of those Old Testament descriptions. But what the historians are saying is that the New Testament writings were written from the perspective of reading the Old Testament. So they're reading the Old Testament and they're asking themselves, what are we going to write about Jesus? Now, of course, it's not so crude as I'm putting it now, but this is the end result. So I'm narrowing it down. Christians over the decades after Jesus left the scene were trying to understand, how did such a bad thing happen to such a good man? Why was he crucified? Let's go to the Old Testament and find out. Even the New Testament writings as they are now show that people were searching the scriptures. They wanted to see where is anything like this mentioned. And so like a drowning man clutching at a straw, they took things from the Old Testament that had nothing to do with Jesus. Like, for example, the virginal conception that they argue on the basis of Isaiah 7:14. And then they apply it to Jesus. And so they wrote the New Testament documents with the Old Testament in mind, trying to prove that Jesus fulfilled those expectations from the Old Testament, even when there was no expectation. The Old Testament may have been talking about something that already happened, like, for example, with Hosea and the Jewish people being healed. And then they applied that to Jesus, that on the third day he will be resurrected from the dead. It wasn't about being resurrected from the dead. It was the whole the Jewish people being revived as a nation. But you see, this is how the New Testament came to be written. And then, they speak about crucifixion. Samuel spoke about let me get Samuel's the notes from Samuel so I get it exactly from him. Okay, so Samuel's points. Okay, yeah. So if Samuel says, okay, Jesus chose his disciples and told them they will receive the Holy Spirit. Well, this too is quite disputed. No historian is going to accept that they received the Holy Spirit, especially as described in the second chapter of Acts of the Apostles. This is all later rewriting of the original story. So we have to come to an understanding of what is the history regarding how Jesus was written about. And this is what Yusuf presented so well. He showed, although he was giving credit to me, but I have to give credit to Christian scholars like Bruce Metzger and others who, for example, Bruce Metzger in his book, The New Testament Documents, it's Development and Growth, something of this nature is in the title, where Bruce Metzger has shown example after example. You take Mark's gospel and then you compare the same incidents in Matthew and Luke, and you see that Matthew and Luke have ballooned the incident to make Jesus look bigger and greater than he was. So if he heals some people in Mark's gospel, he healed them all in Matthew and Luke, and so on. Now, when we go to John's gospel, scholars widely recognize that you can't take John's gospel as being historical. Rudolph mentioned Richard Bauckham. Well, Richard Bauckham, in his book, The Gospel of John, A Short Introduction, has pointed out that the Gospel of John is not generally accepted as being historical. No, the scholars generally think that the Synoptic Gospels are more historical than John, but all of them are theological writings. They are not writing pure history, as has been admitted in the book Jesus, the Unanswered Questions by John Bowden. So we can see how Matthew and Luke improved the stories as they were already found in Mark, which was their source. John Bowden's point is that if we could find Mark's source, we would see that Mark has also improved the story. But we don't have all of Mark's sources. Now, there was an oral gospel before the gospels that we have now, and Matthew and Luke depended on that gospel, according to the reconstruction of many scholars. Now, of course, this is not one of the hard facts, but this is widely accepted that there was a Q gospel. Rudolph spoke of Mark and priority. Side by side with Mark and priority is often the gospel Q that is evoked. Now, the Gospel Q does not show that Jesus will die for the sins of the world. In fact, Daniel Smith, in his book, The Vindication of Jesus, in the Gospel Q, has argued at length that what the Gospel of Q is depicting would indicate that this person to be crucified or that will meet this dreadful end, he will be vindicated by God, and probably it could be interpreted to mean that he would actually be saved alive, which is what Muslims can argue on the basis of the Quran. So,
Kabir, your 7.5 minutes is just finished.
Oh, okay. So I'll leave it at that, and I thank you all for your patient listening, and I look forward to hearing more of your responses. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We're going to move on to Reverend Samuel for your 7 minutes.
Thank you for that, Shabir. I'll just go through many of the points that you've just brought up there. You started off by saying that Muslims and Christians respect Jesus, and as I pointed out in my talk, so do the Baha'i. So that there's a few other religions that accept him. You were talking about the New Testament minimizing John. You really need to give some evidence for that, because John is in all of the Gospels. In the accounts in the book of Acts, when they preach the Gospel, they begin with John. John, yes, is lesser than Jesus, but that's what Malachi chapter 3 and Isaiah 40 say, that there's a messenger who's going to prepare the way for the Lord. So he's not being reduced. He's just having his biblical role. And in fact, what we see of in the Bible is what we also see in Josephus. So what the Bible says about John is what Josephus says. So that's what John was known for. You mentioned that the Jewishness of Jesus is lost due to Paul, and Yusuf brought up the idea that the disciples thought in Greek. So I'm going to sort of deal with those two ideas together. First of all, I find that strange to say that. Matthew begins with a full Jewish genealogy. So Matthew and Luke both have these genealogies which are thoroughly Jewish. Paul calls Jesus fulfilling the promises given to the Jews. In John, he's called the King of the Jews. So I don't think that you can really say that the Jewishness of Jesus is downplayed. In fact, Professor Daniel Boyarin, that I quoted before, he says that the Gospels are thoroughly Jewish and can only be understood as Jewish documents. Yes, there is a difference between how the law is kept, but this was also the case for the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament period before Jesus, the Jewish people did not expect the nations to keep the law. They were under the Noahide covenant from Genesis chapter 9. So there was a different way in which the law was applied even in the Old Testament. And so the gospel has its own way of being applied to Jews and Gentiles in the New Testament. In fact, and this is coming to Yusuf's point a bit more now, far from purging the Jewish thought, that issue is actually being dealt with already. There was a man named Marcion early in the church's history who wanted to get rid of the Jewishness, and the church completely rejected that. And they did it by saying we must keep the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. We must learn about God from there. So there's simply no evidence to say that Jesus has been, that the Gospels undermine his Jewishness. Shabir brought up the idea of how can the divine Son die? Well, I think that that's just the broader issue of understanding the Old Testament and passages like Isaiah 53, and how all of the savior figures in the Old Testament, be it Daniel or David or Joseph, they all suffer before entering their glory and bring salvation. Just a few points with on Yusuf there. You mentioned Blomberg. I'd be keen to see what he actually says there, because I think what you'll find with your quote to your reference to Blomberg is that he's not saying that the Gospels are modeled on mythologies, as you suggested, but on the current biographies of the day. And so there's been a lot of scholarship where people look at the biographies in the Roman world and saying, well, is there a tie to the Gospels? But they're not myths, they're biographies. You spoke about variations in the Gospels, and Shabir also brought this up about Matthew and Luke developing from Mark. But I want to say you've only given half the evidence, because I've looked at this, and what you actually find is sometimes it goes the other direction. What I mean by that is when the man is let down through the ceiling, the roof, and Jesus heals him, the people say in Mark, this is blasphemy. When Jesus forgives the man, they say, this is blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. And so a very strong statement of divinity to Jesus there. Whereas when you read Mark and Luke, it's not there. And so you've given examples of it developing in Matthew and Mark, but I can give you examples where it goes the other way. And so that whole methodology needs to have a more holistic approach to actually get an answer. Just showing one answer, one example actually doesn't show anything, because I can show ones going the other way. Yusuf mentioned that Matthew and Luke contradict each other when it comes to Herod. And you were saying in Matthew, it's when Herod is ruling, and then you talked about in Luke, the census of Quirinius. But I just want to read from Luke chapter 1, verse 5, where it says, in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. And so both Matthew and Luke have it at the time of King Herod. So there's no problem there. You mentioned the genealogies and their different genealogies. Well, that is correct. We have different names in those genealogies. In one sense, it's strange for Jesus to have a genealogy because of his virgin birth. He in one sense, has no genealogy. So it's anyone he's going to have is going to be unusual. How do Christians understand that? Well, we may see one as being more of a political one of the Davidic kings in Matthew. In the other one, it may be more biological, but it's also that people have different names. Most people had several names. So there's even Jesus' disciples. There's Cephas, Simon, and Peter. Now, if you only put one name into a genealogy, you may end up with different genealogies if you're only putting one name in, but that person may have multiple names. But also you mentioned the women being included, and you're right. The women who are in there are these shameful women, and that's actually part of the artistic approach to these genealogies. Matthew actually truncates his genealogy to make an artistic point and includes women in them. So my point there is that other things are going on with these genealogies. You mentioned that the virgin birth was something invented with the story, and we might come back to that. But we actually both believe in the virgin birth, I would have thought. And my final point will be that you said there were different people at the tombs and everything. It's actually not. When you read them in Matthew, it will talk about the three Marys who come to the tomb. And this is often brought up in Bart Ehrman's writings, where he'll say in John, it's just Mary. But when you read Mary in John chapter 20, verse 2, she actually says, we don't know where he is. And so while it only talks about Mary, when you read carefully, there are other people with Mary. So I just want to say that we can answer those objections that you brought up, and that the Bible is actually the place to learn about Jesus. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Reverend Samuel. We'll move on to the next rebuttal, which is from your side, Yusuf, of 7 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all of that, Samuel and Rudolph. Rudolph has raised a number of what we would call Orientalist tropes. So I'll start off with a few. For example, the Arabic infancy gospels. Now, in this regard, I just open up the classical work, the classical Oriental trope, the original source of the Quran by W. St. Clair Tisdale. And this is interestingly what he says in his book. The style of the Arabic of this apocryphal gospel is so bad that it is hardly possible to believe that it dates from Muhammad's time. As, however, Arabic has never been supposed to be the language in which the work was composed, this is a matter of little or no consequence. So he dismisses it. He didn't bother to show that the Arabic gospel apparently appeared a few hundred years after the advent of Islam. And, so basically this idea of borrowing is essentially something which is speculative. So he brushes aside Tisdale, which is the original source of this Orientalist trope, brushes aside the date of the composition as a matter of little or no consequence. You look at people like Malik bin Nabi, the Islamic scholar, I think the Tunisian or Moroccan scholar, he makes the point that, for example, in his writings, that the New Testament, it's certain that no Arabic translation existed in the 4th century of the Hijra. In fact, if you look at he makes mention of the fact that in the library of Leningrad, written about 1060, you've got a Christian text, the first edition of a Christian text of what could be constituted as Afaturi, the Gospels. Sidney Griffiths, for example, basically makes the point that you've got manuscripts dating to about 897. So it's quite clear that the New Testament didn't exist in its form, or at least in the Arabic form, during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. In relation to the infancy Gospel of Thomas, one of the issues that people don't seem to understand, which scholars have pointed out, is that if you look at these Gnostic interpretations, they fundamentally differ with the Quran in terms of how Jesus is presented. So the Quran presents Jesus as a revered prophet, not divine. So it differs fundamentally from the Gnostic interpretation, particularly in relation to how he's presented as an individual. So some scholars have argued that rather than directly copying, some scholars have shown that possibly there is a shared pool of material, and the Quran, in fact, acts as a final authoritative source that preserves certain stories, but of course, reframes them theologically. Then Rudolph brings up the issue of Sister of Aaron. I mean, these are old classical, outdated Orientalist tropes. I mean, for example, if you look at the Hadith, the Christians of Najran during the time of the Prophet, they raised a similar objection in Sahih Muslim. And there's a Hadith which states that, when I came to Najran, they asked me, you read, O sister of Aaron, whereas Moses was born before Jesus. When I came back to Allah's messenger, I asked him about that, and he said, the people of the old age used to give names to their persons after the names of the apostles and pious persons who had gone before them. And this is in Sahih Muslim. So it's quite clear that from the Hadith itself, the Prophet didn't confuse between the two Marys. He pointed out that people from earlier times gave names after the pious people who came before them. So you've got the Muslim exegetes that have already disproved the alleged confusion of the two Marys. You've got a scholar like Barbara Freyes-Tawassa, and she makes a point that Mary's designation as sister of Aaron has led some Christian polemicists to allege a Quranic doctrine of confusion. This controversy is very old, and refutation of the allegation by Muslim authorities is well documented. Ibn Kathir, for example, makes the same point. So this is really, really, really outdated. The other problem is, so the issue is that the sister of Aaron is essentially a title which is referring to chastity and so on and so forth. You've got a similar hadith, for example, where Safiya, the wife of the Prophet, states that Aisha and Hafsa were condescending towards her. And then the Prophet says, you should tell them, how can you be better than me when my husband is Muhammad and my father is Aaron and my uncle is Moses? So obviously it doesn't mean the Prophet is literally saying that. He basically says in another designation of that hadith, the Prophet says, verily you are the daughter of a prophet, your uncle is a prophet, and you are married to a prophet, so how can she boast over you? So it basically shows that this objection is rather weak and rather, doesn't actually make any kind of, there's no argument in relation to that. Regarding Samuel, the scholarly consensus, even from someone as an individual like Craig Blomberg, as an example, states that the Gospels aren't direct first-person eyewitness accounts, but traditions based on eyewitness testimony. So, the anonymity of the Gospel is generally universally acknowledged. There's a universal acknowledged. Most scholars agree that the authors weren't eyewitnesses in a kind of a strict video recording. You mentioned something about the book of Hebrews. I think there is no debate, unless you can show me a scholar, that the book of Hebrews is unknown. If you were going to take the position that it is authored by Paul, then that's an extremely, extremely unscholarly, unacademic approach that you would be adopting. But I'd like to see how we go ahead with that position in the cross-examination. There's clearly contradictions in relation to Paul and Jesus. You say that somehow the other Paul had direct knowledge about the gospel, about what can be found in the gospels much later, but you clearly find the distinction on salvation and law, justification by faith, and the condemnation of the law, whereas Jesus mentions the obedience and faith. Jesus' ministry centered on the earthly kingdom, whereas Paul speaks about the heavenly reality of the church. Faith apart from works, but Jesus himself says not everyone who calls unto him Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven. The issue of divorce, the aspect of diet. In relation to the higher Christology, yes, I agree that there are some who argue for an explosion of early Christology, whereas some argue for an evolutionary view. And I think there is basically the general scholarly consensus seems to be leaning more towards the evolutionary view as opposed to the arguments for early Christology, which is the so-called Big Bang view, people like Martin Hengel and so on and so forth. You mentioned Ibn Ishaq, that Ibn Ishaq acknowledges the Gospel of John. That's totally wrong. That's totally wrong. What he did was he used a passage, John chapter 15, verse 23 to 60, to chapter 16. But he was basically citing Ibn Ishaq to, in fact, find a sort of earlier biblical validation for the existence of the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad. But in the same text, for example, he made deliberate modifications. For example, he changed the text of father in Ibn Ishaq to Ab, from Ab to the word Rab. He, of course, basically believed in the concept of tahrif, corruption, and his text was based on the conviction, the quotation, that the original Injil predicted Muhammad's arrival, and what you've got here in the Gospel of John is just simply some sort of remnant of that original passage which predicted his particular time. So, Dave, I think my time is up. I don't know if I've got any more time to mention anything, but just the last point on Josephus, we can go into Josephus in no way confirms the historicity of Christ, but we can go through that in the cross-examination. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Yusuf. We'll move on to Rudolph for your rebuttal, which is 7 minutes. Thanks, Rudolph.
Well, thank you, guys. It's always interesting to listen and to learn from you. Let me just start off and say that when I speak of the Quranic origins in its context, it's not just the old thing that we can discard. There's actually new scholars that have started looking at this, including Gabriel Said Reynolds, looking at the original sources of the Quran, Harvard Divinity School's Moshe Godarji, Gunther Lullmann, a German theologian, Herbert Berg. There's other scholars, Gary Trumpf, J.C. Reeves. All of these basically look at these instances of the patristics and Gnostic studies, and what they do is they conclude that there are certain elements which are undisputable when we look at the construction of the Quran. So that is what scholarship is saying and what scholarship is maintaining. Then I just want to look at the general outline of my friends and what they've presented. And let me just be very upfront when I say that when I hear some objections about the virgin birth, we should understand that the virgin birth is something which is evidently shown within the Quran and within the literature of Islam itself. And obviously it's something that bears some form of consideration when we consider why the virgin birth. That is obviously not evident within the Quran. When we look at the messianicship and the messianic title of Jesus within the Quran, when we look at titles of Jesus being used in the Quran, we cannot lean on the Quran itself to give life or meaning to those titles. We have to go back to the very Gospels themselves to find some form of meaning and to show exactly what is described when we look at some of these instances. So to just dispel and to say that the earliest Jewish milieu tried to avoid, or the biblical authors tried to avoid the Jewish milieu, I think it's just simply not true. When we look at the Gospels, we can see that the Gospel authors are more interested in actual fulfillment. And when we hear ideas about conflation, let me just say that scholars like Greg Blomberg, even the works of Metzger that have been used, Metzger says it outright. When you look at the way in which he describes some of these conflations which has taken place, he said these authors are trying to make specific theological points. They're not retelling the stories or lying. They're simply explicating and taking and bringing together a coherent picture to the audience that they're trying to bring the gospel to. So if we look at this, it's very important for us to understand that the Gospels in and of itself, there is none earlier than these Gospels. And nowhere does it try to refute or explicate or even downplay what we can find and see when it comes, to instance, to what it's trying to depict historically. We heard it said that the Gospels in and of itself is not really reliable, but let me just say no historian, Christian, Jewish, or atheist argues that Jesus in and of himself can be disregarded when we look at the Gospels and find the Gospels to be of a primary importance. If you remove the Gospels, you basically lose half of antiquity. Everything we can know, everything we can basically see, everything these secular scholars like Tacitus and some of the scholars that Samuel have mentioned, if we take these claims of the scripture out, we can know and everything in antiquity basically collapse. Now, Shabir mentioned also that when we look at Jesus, we can see that he had suicidal thoughts, and there was this understanding that he wanted to orchestrate his own crucifixion. But that's not what the Gospels say. When we look at Mark chapter 14:36, we can see that Jesus prays to avoid death. He asks the Father to take this cup away from him. But what is standing and what is assured in all of the Gospels is that Jesus was crucified. In actual fact, all of the historical evidences that we can lean upon, and one of the critical facts that we can uphold is in antiquity, is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Even critical scholars assert it. Now, we heard that, okay, it might be a swooning. It might be something where Jesus woke up in a cool tomb, and he basically tried then to portray that as his resurrection. Let me just say, there were Roman soldiers that ensured that the people that were on the cross were dead. These were executioners. The scourging Jesus endured, the spear wounds that was fatal, the burial conditions make survival impossible. If you look at the amount of spices and the weight that would have been on him, all of these things show that there was absolutely no semi-conscious survival in any way or form. In actual fact, the swoon theory is just a modern-day myth that was constructed. Also, Yusuf mentioned about the pagan myths. He said that there was some influence that was actually bearing upon the reason the authors wrote. But recent studies have shown that the influence of Hellenism, especially on the biblical authors, were largely superficial. And you can look at works from Peter Green, you can look at works from G.W. Borshak, you can go on and on and on, and you can see quite clearly that these scholars have showed emphatically that although Judaism and Christianity were surrounded by Hellenistic culture, they even died martyrs' death to maintain their own culture. So I think that is something counted for when we actually look at the understanding of these authors and how they articulated what they were trying to say. Also, some of the objections that Yusuf mentioned, I tried to write all of them down, but the pencil is slower than the tongue. So I hope I get some of these. But some of the objections, like where Jesus says, only God is good. It is very important to note that Matthew doesn't weaken Jesus' claim. He actually assumes it. And the passage challenges the listener to recognize who Jesus really is. He's not trying to deny or downplay who Jesus is. He already affirms that in the first and second chapter, that he is the Ha'adam, he is the one to come. The fig tree shows ignorance of Jesus. It's very interesting that when we look at the fig tree incident, the fig tree story is a prophetic action that illustrates Israel's unfaithfulness. It's not a botanical mistake or Jesus's ignorance. The different genealogies that Yusuf mentioned, the genealogies reflect different theological emphases to different authors in different contexts. We know that one is Jewish, one is royal, one is universal, and one is human. All of these have different emphases for different authors. The virgin birth. Let me just say that the omission from the other gospels basically does not deny the virgin birth. Not even the Quran denies the virgin birth. It just shows narrative focus. And John Gilchrist actually describes this beautifully in his Jesus Disfigured book. Again, the fact that the Quran lacks any supernatural Jesus, that's just not true. Contrary to the popular claim, the Quran is full of supernatural accounts of Jesus. So we can go on and on and on, and we can see that these things that were raised against the biblical text in and of itself is unfounded and simply not clear. And I think my time's up. I'll leave it at that.
Your time is up. So we are going to move on to the time of cross-examination now, which is 20 minutes each. So we're going to start off with Dr. Shabir and Yusuf having an opportunity to ask Samuel and Rudolph the questions they would like. So I'll hand over to both of you to decide on how best to structure your 20 minutes in terms of questions.
Okay, let me just time myself.
And Dr. Shabir, you're on mute.
Are you there? Have I lost anyone?
We're still here. I think Dr. Shabir is just on mute.
You have to unmute yourself. You go to the unmute section.
I got it. Okay.
Have you got it?
Okay, gentlemen. So, Yusuf, if you allow me, I want to start with this last point that Rudolph made. Okay, and I'm going to support Yusuf's point here. So the Quran has as Rudolph rightly said, both have supernatural elements. But a key difference I want you to observe, Rudolph, is that the Quran has an enhanced human being, that is Jesus. The Bible, on the other hand, is presenting a divine person, especially in the writings of Paul, in Hebrews and in John's Gospel and in the book of Revelation. So we have here a divine being who takes on human qualities. So there's a lot of difference between these two presentations. So with the Quran just giving us an enhanced human being, this is a human being who is working under the grace of God. Yes, he can blow life into the clay birds, but only with the permission of God. The Quran is always careful to emphasize that point. And you found with the scholars that you cite, which are actually scholars from within the Christian tradition, who find the Quran objectionable from this point of view. So on the one hand, I'm glad that Christian scholars are able to recognize when something goes off the course of monotheism. But here you have misunderstood the Quran, because it's saying that Jesus is doing this with the permission of God. So monotheism is preserved. But do you see the difference between the Quran showing an enhanced human being and the Bible showing a humanized divine being?
You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Yes, Dr. Shabir, I would affirm the very fact that we can, in fact, affirm exactly what you said. The point that I was making, though, is that when we look at the Quran, we can see that the Quran attributes certain miracles that encroach upon God's exclusive domain, especially in a Jewish understanding, that would violate absolute monotheism in that. And I've mentioned Richard Balcom highlighting and showing that Judaism had the central belief that God was the sole creator. And the creative act of Jesus blowing life into clay birds seems to violate that very absolute construct or understanding of God's own authority and appeal. Therefore, I do not deny that Jesus historically is a supernatural person. But what I would say, there's a problem posed to Islamic theology when it is only Yahweh that creates ex nihilo. And in Genesis 2:7 is the one that emanates life and blows life into man. That is not purported to the Jesus of the Bible. That strict line is delineated to show the difference between Father enabling Son and Son doing what the Father enabled in Christian theology. In the Islamic context, again, it's not there. But then what I've shown further is, where is that reliance historically? It is not found in the gospel documents that we have, which is earliest, but it is succinct with the Gospel of Thomas, chapter 2 in the 2nd century.
Okay. Now, Rudolph and Yusuf, I'll give you a chance in a moment. So you mentioned a number of scholars like Gabriel Hyde Reynolds. Did you read Gabriel Hyde Reynolds' latest book on the Quran being originating in a Christian context? That's one. Did you read this one by Sidney Griffith, the Bible in Arabic? And how about this one, The Quran's Reformation of Judaism and Christianity, edited by Holger Zelentin? So what these last two books in particular have in common is the recognition that the Quran was in its environment, looking at both the Bible and other materials that were in circulation, and the Quran is using those materials to present its own distinct theology. But with reference to the Bible, the Quran is actually intending to correct the biblical narrative. So the Quran is taking an independent stance here in looking at the materials which are popular among Christians, whether they're in the Bible or apocryphal materials from the Christian point of view, and saying, okay, if you take that story, these are the morals that should come out of it, or this is the theology that should be derived from that story. So if we take Jesus creating or from the clay birds and then blowing life into it, this is with the permission of God. It is not that Jesus has some inherent property on his own that would make him a God. So I find it, on the one hand, curious, and that you think that if Jesus does this on his own, this would be a compromise to monotheism, and the Quran does not say that Jesus does it on his own, so the Quran is free of that charge. But on the other hand, you say that God could give Jesus, his son, that power, and then the son could create. And that would not be a compromise to monotheism. Of course, it's a compromise to monotheism, because here you have two creators, one who is God himself, and the other who, without needing God's permission anymore, he has been vouchsafed that power. He has the power in himself. He can just create as he wants. So now we have two creators. In fact, more than this, you have it in John's gospel that without Jesus, nothing was made. So Jesus, according to John's gospel, especially in that introduction, which some scholars think is a later addition into John's gospel, the first 18 verses. So according to those first 18 verses, Jesus is the one who created everything. So when we look up, we don't see God as our creator. We see Jesus as our creator. Is that not a compromise to monotheism? But my main point is that as it relates to this debate, how do you square the actual Jesus on the ground? So we have a real Jesus on the ground. We have the historian's reconstruction of Jesus, and now we have two books which are presenting Jesus, the Bible and the Quran. So now Yusuf's point is that if we want to defend the Jesus of the Bible and the Quran, which one is closer to the historical Jesus? The historians will all agree that Jesus was a human being. He was a Jew who lived in Palestine, and he was crucified by the Roman authorities. Okay, so how does that gel with either the Quran or the Bible? In the Quran, he's an enhanced human being who could suffer something like the crucifixion, but of course God saves him. In the Bible, like if he is that humanized divine being, how could that divine being be crucified? So this is, well, you have to show that your Bible is actually more in harmony with the historical reconstruction than the Quran is. And I don't think you can do that on these fundamental points. Only on the little points you can say, okay, it looks like the Quran does not have this point that is there in the Bible, and so on. But on these major issues, it's a slam dunk that the Quran actually presents a Jesus that is more in line with the actual Jesus who walked the ground, who can reasonably be imagined in our own minds and also not reconstructed by the historians. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I think Samuel will be better with this, but let me give it a go. There were many things mentioned that I would like to address. I would simply state that, and again, like I said, Samuel showed this in his introduction, that the gospel can be seen as primary historical documents because they meet the criteria of standard historical documents in use of ancient sources. There's nothing earlier. Even if you give a late date to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, they're still the closest proximate biographies of Jesus than any other sources. That is very important. I think secondly, something that Samuel mentioned is the fact that these gospels were based on eyewitness testimony or direct access to the eyewitnesses, where he says that Luke claims that he relies on eyewitness, John claims first-hand testimony. Mark is widely connected to Peter, a lot of people believe, according to Papias. But the fact is that the Gospels in the eyewitness testimony shows quite clearly that it can be classified as primary historical material. So I can go on, and I think Samuel will sort the rest out. What I want to say, though, is when we look at the person of Jesus in the Quran, and this is a point that is fascinating to me, is that when we look at the Jesus of the Quran, when I speak of the creative acts, I did not deny that anywhere in the Quran it says that Jesus did things by God's permission. No doubt. What I'm saying is the author of the Quran makes a mistake in granting Jesus the actual creative power of creating. He's doing in action something which is only reserved for God. If he does it by God's permission, it violates Jewish monotheism. It violates a biblical constitution of the miraculous. You can look at Craig Keenan as well. I've mentioned Richard Balcom. But both agreed that when we look at the actual act of creation, that is something reserved to God alone. And the gospel authors, and even Paul, tries to show quite clearly that Jesus encompasses two realities, one of transcendent infinitude and one of infinite immaturity, meaning that he is fully man. When he walks upon the earth, he is our perfect example. As Philippians chapter 2 says, he laid aside his divine privileges. He became a man like us. He served as our perfect example for us to show us exactly how we should enact the will of God. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul shows quite clearly that he's the second Adam. He restores that which we believe Adam lost. He becomes that perfect example, and he becomes that perfect mediator before God and man. He's the only man that can perfectly stand, and he can perfectly associate himself with humanity because he's the perfect man, but he's also the divine man, which means that he has pre-existed with the Father. He had an association with the Father even before the world began, and he is the only one fit to stand before the Father in his infinitude and be the perfect representation for us before the Father. John Gilchrist has got this beautiful thing that he says. He says the Father is God for us, Jesus is the Son with us, and the Spirit is God in us, which is beautiful. That relating again to what I've said about what we can conceive about what is given to as priority in the Quran seems to be void, because when we look at the Quran, we can see quite clearly, again, like I said, it's not just myself, it's not just this Dill. There are numerous scholars. I've read through Gabriel Reynolds. I've read the Study Quran, even the Study Quran. Even Nasser Hussain admits that there are certain elements within the Quran which relates more to early Gnostic tendencies. You can't just say these stories were told and they were in the milieu of the people in the surrounding time, and therefore they were absorbed in the Quran. No. The Quran claims to speak of the post-resurrection and pre-life experiences of Christ, but it doesn't include those realities. It includes realities, and it includes certain elements which is in total violation of what we can deduce about the historical Jesus. And again, like I said, I've mentioned a quote of John Gilchrist. The problem with the Quran and its records is that they repeat legends alongside historical material. We know these things are legends. We know these things have been influenced and written by the hand of normal people, yet they find themselves within the Quran. That is the problem that we've got with the Quranic Jesus. The Quranic Jesus is simply an argument against not Orthodox Christianity, because it seems, and that's what I've tried to show.
What about the post-dated compositions, Rudolph? The fact that just the post-dated compositions of the apocryphal Arabic Gospels that post-date the Quran. Can you address that issue?
Yes,
that's not my question. That wasn't my question, but I'm saying that if you're saying a source material, a lot of the Arabic material come much later after the Quran.
Yeah. In any case, Yusuf, I've taken a lot of time here, so I want to leave the rest to you. It's only like 7 minutes remaining, so go ahead, Yusuf. Whatever which your line.
That wasn't my question. Maybe you can address that, but I just want maybe you and Samuel to address just 3 issues. I want to make out specifically. Firstly, about this Christology, and I no doubt Samuel will quote passages from Mark which can show to a certain extent a high Christology, but I just want to demonstrate three passages here. Firstly, in Mark 4:38, the storm at sea. In Mark 4:38, the disciples said, "Teacher, do you not care we are perishing?" In Matthew, the same narrative is given, and the disciples are saying, "Kairi soson apolymitha, Lord, save us, we are perishing." That's my first issue, is that on the one hand, there's a rebuke, there's a condescension, there's a showing that Jesus has a don't care. But in the other one, they're saying, "Lord, save us." And they use a specific word in Greek. That's the first point. The second point is that, and this is because it's all related, in regards to fig tree, I have no doubt that the depiction can be used as a parable to show those who refuse to bear fruit will be dealt with in symbolic of the curse. The point being made is that why does one show Jesus having a lack of knowledge of the season, the earlier gospel, but the later gospel basically says that his knowledge was limited. He didn't know the season. It removes the lack of knowledge of the season in Matthew, which is contained in Mark. And the last point is that if there is no development, just to give one last example about the crucifixion, in Mark, he prays that his soul is troubled. But in John's gospel, he even says, he declares he will not pray. And he's not shown to be praying in that way. So on those 3 points, can you explain why you have this discrepancy, or at the very least, which shows some sort of distinct personality surrounding Christ in terms of how he's presented on those 3 particular passages? Either Rudolph or Sam.
So I'll answer these ones.
Sure.
So we're really looking at the idea of development, and you've given 3 examples. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're pointing out that in, I think it's in Mark, you said.
Mark 4:38, yeah.
Yep, that in the storm they say, teacher. In Matthew, it says, Lord, save us. I guess I'd go to John 13:13, where Jesus says, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher. So we actually see that the disciples, remember there's a group of at least 12 men with him, and they're both using these words. And we've actually got reference to that, John 13:13, where it says they called him both Lord and teacher. So I don't see Matthew changing it. I see that that's just part of the historical eyewitness flexibility that you have as an eyewitness to.
So Samuel, can I stop you on that point so I'm not misunderstood? I'm not talking about the utilization of words, of course, teacher, Lord, but the concern I want you to address is on the one passage they say if there's a rebuke. Do you not care we are perishing? Don't you care that we are drowning? Where's your concern? In the next passage in Matthew, the later gospel, they're saying, save us, we are perishing. There's a direct translation of a rebuke to one of obeisance. So it's not just simply teacher and Lord. How do you explain the distinction between the two, if not that there's certainly a kind of an evolution in terms of how Jesus is presented, from a rebuke to a prayer?
Well, I don't see it as a rebuke.
Well, do you not care we are perishing? Is that not a rebuke? Don't you have care? Don't you care my son is running on the road? Don't you care? What's your problem? We are drowning. Do something about this. In the next instance, they say, save us, Lord, we are perishing. Is there no distinction between the two?
Well, I just see that both are true and just bringing up different aspects of the one event.
Which one happened? Which one happened?
Well,
both of them couldn't have happened.
Well, why not?
So no, but hold on. You have a narrative. If, for example, your son's running across the road, your wife tells you, don't you care your son's running around on the road? And then next you have a narrative which says, go save your son, he's running on the road. There's a distinction between the two. There's clearly a distinction. So which one happened? Did they tell him we are perishing? Don't you care that we are drowning? Or did they tell him, Lord, save us, we are drowning?
No, let me answer it. I'm saying both are true, and then one is just an earlier expression of then what happens later on. One saying, Lord, save us, we're drowning. So sorry, don't you care? And then the other's just picking up, Lord, save us. I mean, they're all just aspects.
So there's a lack of reverence. There's a lack of reverence in Mark, right? There's a lack of reverence in Mark. Why is the lack of reverence in Mark?
Calling out. Sorry, they're both calling out for salvation. They're just saying it in different ways. And as I said, I think this is well within the realms of eyewitness flexibility to an event. So I just don't see...
And just the last point about the prayer. Why is it in John's gospel? He emphasizes he will not pray. I have to go to the quotation, but in Mark, he says, Lord, I think take this cup away from me. And he became exceedingly sorrowful and drops of blood, his tears were like drops of blood and so on. Why is it that at that crucifixion, there's no troubling of the soul in John's gospel?
There is troubling of the soul. I've got to find it, but I've looked at this specifically in my Bart Ehrman video where there actually is, where he says, now my soul is deeply troubled, but what shall I say? I've got to go and find it now.
Yeah, it's 12:27. John 12:27.
Yeah.
John 12:26. Now my heart is troubled. So it's exactly the same as in the synopsis.
Yeah, but notice the denial. He says, what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I came to this hour. So it's a different presentation of Jesus.
No, because that's exactly what we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where he says, not my will, but your will be done. It's exactly the same.
Not really, because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he prays. In John's gospel, he doesn't pray. He said, no, I'm not going to pray.
Well, I mean, you've just directed it to it. He says, now my heart is troubled.
Yes.
We see him troubled in Matthew.
So in the synoptics, that's followed by a prayer. He's asking, save me from this hour. But in John's gospel, he says, I won't pray to be saved from the hour because I came for this hour.
So did he pray or didn't he pray? That's a problem.
Well, I'm saying that both of them have Jesus praying that he's in trouble.
No,
Samuel.
No, that's not prayer. Samuel, don't fudge the facts here. Just be clear. Let's be honest. In John's gospel, he's clearly saying, "I won't pray." Like his soul is troubled. Okay, that's the prelude.
Yeah.
So the prelude in the synoptics goes to next comes the prayer. In John's gospel, next comes the denial. I won't pray.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're overlooking a fact. Is this actually in the Garden of Gethsemane?
No, it is not. It is not. But that's when he enters Jerusalem. But in John's gospel, there is no prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, because when he enters Jerusalem in Mark chapter 12, in John chapter 12, as we have just been looking at, he already declared in advance he's not going to pray like that. So John's writer is not going to have him pray in Gethsemane later, and he doesn't.
Well, whether or not we can say what John's gospel will or won't do, we are talking about two different times in Jesus' life.
Yeah, but if he's God and if he's already predicted that he will not pray like that, then he won't pray like that.
Well, all I can say is that he talks about his death and resurrection and has to go through the struggle with that, and we see that expressed at different times.
But why is it so hard for you to accept that in 3 gospels he prays, "Save me from this hour," and in the 4th gospel he says, "I won't pray like that"?
Well, I'm just saying that at this earlier stage, that's what he says, and later on he says something different.
Oh, so then God changed his mind?
No, I'm not saying that God changed his mind, but I'm saying these are two different periods of time.
Yes. So in the earlier period, he said he won't pray like that, but in the later period, he prayed like that.
Where does he say, "I won't pray like that"?
He says in John chapter 12, John chapter 12, verse number 27, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." So the statement, "Father, save me from this hour," that's what we know from this prayer in the Synoptic Gospels. He prayed like that. And here he's saying, "I won't pray like that."
Well, all I can say is that we have both, and that we certainly see him struggling with it, and that this is just John's way of putting it there.
But I mean, it's irreconcilable. I think the point Dr. Shabir Ali was making is that why is there no concession, even amongst, people of your caliber, that there are problems here? That to take an inerrant position, it just comes out badly. It comes out very unscholarly and unacademic. If you can concede the point that, look, there's a genuine problem, then at least there's some degree of respectability in your apologetics that you could engage in. Like for example, some of the conservative scholars concede that point. Why is it that a lot of
because I don't agree with your argument. First of all, Jesus does not say in John 12:27, "I will not pray this." What he says is, "Father, take this from me." No, right? No, for this is why I've come. But this is what we have in the Synoptics, where he says, "Father, take it from me," and he goes, "No, your will be done." So I'm saying it's the same progression.
No, not really, Samuel. No, apparently you're looking at this point for the first time, so it's taking you a while to swallow the pill. But go back and look at it very carefully. In the Synoptic Gospels, he's praying, "Now my soul is troubled. Father, save me from this hour." In John's Gospel, he's saying, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No." Yeah. It is for this reason that I came. So in John's Gospel, he is declaring in advance he will not pray like that. Yep. But in the Synoptics, he prays like that.
Sure. In fact, in Greek, I'm just looking at the Greek, Samuel. It says, "Allah dia totu elthon eis ten horan toten." It's on account of this I came on. There's an emphasis in the Greek itself that I'm not going to pray. He's not spelling it out, but he's asking himself, shall I say, "Father, save me from this hour"? No, of course not. On account of this I came. So there's clearly a distinction which you have to acknowledge. There's no scope for interpretation here. That's the whole point. It's not an interpretive exegetical approach we're going. The text is so clear, which Shabir was mentioning. And why is it that you won't recognize that? That's the problem.
I can see what you're saying, but what I am saying is that it still has this progression of acknowledging that his heart is troubled, right? This is what I'm saying, that there is this acknowledgement of his heart is troubled, and then he's saying, save me from this hour. But
no, he's not saying save me from this hour in John's gospel. He's not saying that. He's saying I won't say that. He's asking, shall I say that? No.
Yeah. So, gentlemen, we are at 25 minutes in the first part of the...
That is a good point that I will need to go away and investigate more. And, I have looked at it before, and I thought that the idea of just his heart being troubled and accepting God's will aligned up. But you've raised a good point there.
Just one point. It ties into the idea that John the Baptist in John's gospel presents Jesus as a sacrificial lamb. So if he's a sacrificial lamb who takes away the sins of the world, then this narrative and account in John 12:27, in fact, makes sense. Whereas in Mark and the earlier gospels, it at least at the very certain stages, there's this kind of disconcertedness, hesitation on his part, and that hesitation is not there in John's, because if he's giving himself voluntarily, giving himself, there's a different portrayal, is what is being mentioned in Mark's gospel.
Well, that's what I was saying before, that when we look at the overall, well, then I don't agree with that. I'm saying that in both he resigns himself. He's troubled in both, right? He's troubled in both, but then he resigns himself to his Father's will. So, yeah, I mean, we're finished there, but I want to say overall, they're saying the same thing, but you've raised an interesting point that I need to get back to.
Thanks, Samuel. I think we'll use that as a good break into the next part of the cross-examination, where Rudolph and yourself, Samuel, will have 26 minutes to ask questions of Shabir and Yusuf.
Okay, you say 26 minutes. Here we go. Okay, so my first question is for both of you, and that is, you're talking about the Quran is engaging with the milieu, the stories that the Christians have, and so when we have this story of Jesus creating birds from clay, it presents it as a real event, but we know that it wasn't. We know when it came from, and so it's not a real event. So just engaging with it is not the idea. It's presenting it as real history. So that's why we would say the Quran is historically unreliable.
Well, let me answer that if you don't mind, Yusuf. Christian scholars are struggling now with the question of whether Adam was a real person, as presented in the book of Genesis in particular. Scott McKnight, writing with Venema in the book Adam and the Genome, says that there were all these presentations of Adam. There's the literary Adam of the book of Genesis, and then there are so many apocryphal Adams in the book of Jubilees and so many others, Ecclesiasticus and so on. And then Paul constructs his own variety of Adam. And then he contrasts that with Jesus. So now we have all these different Adams. Which one was the real and historical Adam? So he says that the Bible is not really dealing with that question. There's a literary Adam that is presented in the book of Genesis to begin with, and then further elaborated on and goes off in different ways in the apocryphal writings. And then Paul has his own slant on that. So they're not talking about the actual Adam who lived, whatever time he lived. Dr. William Lane Craig, in his book on the historical Adam, posits that Adam would have been from among the Homo heidelbergensis, who lived close to 1 million years ago. And to defend that view he does it from a scientific angle, but he also now has to deal with the book of Genesis. And he says that the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis is what he calls mytho-history, in which case there is mythology and history combined. And how to separate the two is not always clear. But what he would say is that there is a literary Adam that is there in the book of Genesis. And that is what the New Testament writers are dealing with. They're not dealing with the actual factual Adam, if at all he existed. So now, with that background in mind, with Christians struggling with this, may I posit to you that the Quran, according to these writers, like the Quran's Reformation of Judaism and Christianity by Holger Ellington and Sidney Griffiths, The Bible in Arabic, what they're saying is that the Quran is in a milieu where people believe certain things, they have certain stories. What the Quran is talking about is the truth in the story. And what that has, what conclusions can we reach of a moral and theological nature? So the Quran is concerned not so much with the historical truth on the ground, but the theological and moral truths. Now, you might say, why doesn't the Quran just simply correct all of that misunderstanding that they have and give them the actual history? Well, then the Quran would have to do like reverse all of human development. There was a book written by the name of Humans as the Storytelling Animal. I don't remember the author's name, but you can look it up very easily. What he has, the author has shown is that human beings evolved telling stories. And by telling stories, this is the way language is taught to children to begin with. And it is the way in which moral and theological truths and other sorts of good teachings are preserved for people. This was the vehicle by which people learn things and memorize things. The story meant something to them. For the Quran now to do what it needed to do was to teach moral and theological truths. Then to go back and try to correct all of this from a historical point of view would really be shooting itself in the foot. So the Quran is saying, okay, you know these stories. So what should you learn from those stories? What is the moral of the story? And that's what the Quran is doing.
Yeah, can I give a quick follow-up question that will put a lid on it?
Yeah.
So Shabir, you are willing to concede that the Quran took this miracle directly from known apocryphal written or oral legends rather than divine revelation or historical facts? And
well,
further,
okay.
Let me just finish. Is there any historical evidence other than the Gospel of Thomas that depict that tale that we've just mentioned?
Okay, so it's not an either or, Rudolph. Mm-hmm. It's I don't know of any other depiction other than the infancy Gospel of Thomas. To answer your second part, but the important
no, wait, just hold on. Case closed. If you can only relate a fully known story that directly relates to the Gospel of Thomas in the 2nd century, that's the only place we find it. We do not find it in a historical narrative somewhere, somebody quoting it. It's not an antiquity. The only place we find this story of the creation of the birds is in the Gospel of Thomas in the 2nd century. You've just
there's
mentioned...
no reproduction.
Okay, but here, Rudolph asked me a question. Let me answer. Rudolph, you asked me a question and I didn't answer. I didn't finish answering. Okay, you asked me two questions. I jumped to give you an answer on the second question, and you're jumping on the answer. But let me answer your first question, okay? So your first question was, is it by revelation or is it that he got it from the apocryphal sources? And my answer is that the two are not like an either or. It could be that God is guiding the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, to look at all the stories that are available about Jesus, especially the ones which are popular at the time. By the way, I mean, for all you can say about the Gospel of Thomas, the infancy Gospel in particular, this is written by Christians and read by Christians and popular at the time. So the Quran is
not
taking
early Gnostics.
But you can call them non-Christians if you want, but they will call themselves Christians, and maybe they will not call you Christian. So the question of who is the Christian and who is not, this is irrelevant. What is important is that the Quran is making an impact on that milieu at the same time, at the set time. And the Quran is looking at the stories that are available already. God is guiding the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, to reshape these narratives, to bring out the theological truths that should have been there but have been lost on the people. So the infancy Gospel of Thomas presents Jesus as a brat who has all of this divine power and he doesn't know what to do with it, so he kills children. Where is that in the Quran? It's not in the Quran, because the Quran is reshaping the story and saying to them, you don't have to think of Jesus like that. Look, I'm not gonna throw away your Gospel of Thomas, But I'm going to tell you that, that beloved Jesus from the Gospel of Thomas that you already know, who creates the birds. Well, here he has how he does it. He does it with the permission of God. So the Quran is not asserting, to use the terms that William Lane Craig used in reference to Genesis. The Quran is not concerned here with the actual truth of what happened in history. The Quran is concerned here with the truth that is there in the story. And the Quran is bringing out the theological and moral truths that should be the conclusion from this story. So if you think that Jesus had all of this power, where does he get this power from? He is doing these things by the will and permission of God. So this is revelation from God. This is divine guidance to the Prophet Muhammad. It's not an either or.
Shabir, can I just add one thing before Rudolph comes in? I've just looked. If you look at the discussion in Britannica on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, what the story goes essentially is a rebuke for Jesus violating the Sabbath, because the story is he gathers his 12 sparrows, he brings them to life by clapping his hands, and then he commands them. Then the Jew reports this to Joseph, and then Joseph scolds Jesus for violating the Sabbath. But now, if you look at the Quranic narrative, I'm not so sure if you're familiar with what Muhammad Asad basically states on Surah 349 and 5110. The word in Arabic that is used for clay birds, or Arabic in birds, the word is toyer. And the Arabic word for toyer also idiomatically can mean a fortune or destiny in pre-Islamic and Quranic usage. So, for example, Asad, in that translation, he translates a passage metaphorically. He's basically saying that Jesus intimated to the children of Israel that he would fashion the vision of a soaring destiny like toyer out of the humble clay of their lives. And so as a result of that vision brought to life by his inspiration would become their real destiny by God's leave and their faith. So that basically aligns with Asad's general approach of interpreting the story as, a parabolic myth with a didactic purpose rather than an actual historical event involving physical creation. Because the way it's presented in the infancy gospels, it shows Jesus as a brat. He's killing people. He's doing mischievous actions. And the story doesn't tie up with what the Quran, because in Surah Fil, for example, chapter 105, it also speaks about birds, and there the word is toiron ababil in relation to the army of the elephants, and they being pelted with stones of baked clay, sijil. And Asad notes that in that context, the toir can mean any flying creature, whether a bird or an insect, but no authentic tradition actually confirms that. And let me just finish this point. And that could essentially give rise to the virulent epidemic of smallpox. So you've got two narratives. They're not totally parallel, although there's a similarity. And both of them have different moral usages. The infancy gospel speaks about Jesus being a brat and breaking the Sabbath. The Quranic narrative, on the other hand, as Asad basically points out, kind of gives the indication that Jesus is in fact intimating to the children of Israel that he would fashion the toyer, the vision of a destiny, because idiomatically the word toyer could mean bird. It can also mean fortune. It could also mean destiny in pre-Islamic and Quranic usage. And Edward Lane confirms that. Lisan al-Arab, in fact, confirms that. So the general scholarly consensus is that the event should be treated as non-literal. If you take it literally, then you may find some slight parallels. But in fact, even from that perspective, the story in the infancy Gospels of Thomas are not the same as you find in the Quran. This would be my submission on that point.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we've just...
Are you familiar with what Asad has said on this and how he has described this?
No, I'm not, but I know how Muslims understand this story, in that when they retell the story of Jesus' life, they say he actually did these things. And from what I hear both of you saying, you're saying that it's just an engagement with the stories, and that Jesus actually did these things is not an issue. And if that's the case, then this is not the real Jesus.
No, but also that the word toyer, which is translated as bird, could be idiomatically used for fortune, for destiny. So when he tells the children of Israel, he's going to fashion, in a manner of speaking, their destiny out of the humble clay of their lives, which is how Asad basically translates it. He's essentially saying that without any kind of literalistic rendering.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that...
Here, I want to answer your question, Samuel.
They don't take it that way.
Okay,
they don't take it that way. They take it as real events.
Yeah, So then, yeah. So we're asking about, whether the event was real and whether Jesus was real. That's not necessarily the same thing. So the real Jesus was a Jewish person who worshipped God, who proclaimed monotheism, and that's what the Quran presents. Now, are the events that are mentioned in the Gospels that you have in your canon all real events? No. So you're complaining because the Quran seems to have something in common with what you call an apocryphal gospel. And yes, we're not championing that gospel, but on the other hand, it seems that if the Quran had something in common with what you call the canonical gospels, then the Quran gets a free pass. No, it doesn't necessarily mean that because what you have in the canonical gospel is called canonical, then that means it's necessarily true. So whether the Quran is engaging with the Gospel of Thomas or the Quran is engaging with the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're all in the same basic ballpark. Yes, it is true that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are earlier than the infancy Gospel of Thomas, and they have a greater degree of respectability. But what if the Quran were to align with the statement in Matthew's Gospel that the saints came out of their tombs and they appeared to many people in Jerusalem? Even Mike Lacona, who debated with me many times, admits that this is just like special effects that Matthew is presenting as part of the story, but it is not the historical event. What about the guards at the tomb? When Rudolph was speaking against the swoon theory, he's bringing all the points from the Gospels, like the spear wound. This is thought to be unhistorical. And what about the guards at the tomb? Dr. William Lane Craig calls this, I hate to use the word, but it's his word, he calls it a stupid story, because it's not coherent. It doesn't make any sense to say that the guards were at the tomb, Jesus appeared, and they saw Jesus, and they went and told everyone that the disciples told the body, and so on, and the Jewish rabbis bribed them to keep the story closed. So if the Quran were to align with any of that, does the Quran get a free pass? No.
No, I'm not asking that. That's not even the issue. The issue is exactly that both of you have just been saying that what Muslims take as genuine events in Jesus' life, you're now saying are just literary interactions, and that's not what Jesus did. And so my point is that's not the historical Jesus. You don't learn about Jesus. What you're learning out there is actually.
But Samuel, sorry.
Hang on, let me finish. Okay. Right? You guys have been talking for a solid 10, 15 minutes. What you can say then about the Quran is that it's not about the historical Jesus. It's about Christian discussions about Jesus. And so it's more in the realm of tafsir. It's a tafsir discussion that we're having. It's not an actual Jesus did these things, right? So in my answer to that, Reverend Samuel, I've already pointed out that there's a difference between real events in the life of Jesus and the real person Jesus. So when we think of the real person Jesus, should we be saying, Lord Jesus, save me? Or should we be thinking of Jesus as a humble human being who prayed to God, who preached monotheism? That is the Quranic Jesus, the one who practiced Jewish law. He was a Jewish person, and they crucified him because they didn't recognize him to be God. This is very clear. If they thought he was God, they wouldn't have tried to crucify him. Now, so that is the real Jesus. So there's the real Jesus, and then there are events in the life of Jesus. Now, who can go back into the history and determine that all of these events actually happened? So you like the events that are mentioned in your Gospels, but you quoted E.P. Sanders, Reverend Samuel. E.P. Sanders says, okay, these are the facts that we can determine from the life of Jesus. It's not all of the facts of the Gospels. No, most of the Gospel events are discounted by scholars. What about John the Baptist declaring that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, as Yusuf was pointing out? Now, this was not in the Synoptic Gospels, and if it was in the Synoptic Gospels, how is it that in the Synoptic Gospels people don't know whether Jesus is the Messiah or not? In fact, even in John's Gospel, they keep asking him, "Are you the Messiah? Like, who are you? Like, tell us." In John chapter 8, he's having this back and forth, and they're saying, "No, a prophet cannot arise from reality." Questions. I mean, you've asked about 5 good questions there.
Yeah.
So
I just want to make a point,
Go ahead.
Samuel, but it's
Hold on,
related. I don't
Yusuf.
want to interrupt
Just hold on,
you.
Yusuf.
Samuel.
Yusuf, we all want to make points. We want to get to it as well.
Yeah.
No, but it's
Samuel.
related to your issue. I want to ask, but well, not ask you. I want to just.
No, we're
encounter
asking
to
you
your
the
question.
questions. It's our
No,
turn to ask.
Samuel to speak. If that's okay. Samuel,
Right.
are we
Go
to-
ahead, guys. Ask away. Ask away. We're here to
Go ahead,
answer.
go ahead.
Now, first of all, I just want to make the claim.
Okay.
I never claimed. First of all, with E.P. Sanders and what he recommends, what he says about Jesus and what he taught, he also acknowledges that Jesus was a first century Jew who saw himself in that eschatological role. And so that means the teaching on the Son of Man that we have is, E.P. Sanders may not believe this, but no one doubts that Jesus taught he was the Son of Man who comes in the clouds of heaven and approaches the throne of God. And as I pointed out with Daniel Boyarin,
Okay, but here, Samuel, you're wrong about that. Because first of all, you mentioned E.P. Sanders saying that Jesus was this apocalyptic prophet. All of those who say he was an apocalyptic prophet, including E.P. Sanders, says that he was a failure. He thought that it would happen in his lifetime, but it didn't.
But that's not the point.
Okay.
That's still
and the Son of Man. Son of Man, you're premising your question on the idea that all the scholars agree that he claimed to be the Son of Man.
No, I'm not doing that at all. I'm not doing that at all.
Okay.
I'm saying that, well, if you let me finish, right?
Okay. But you were saying that all of the scholars, the historians agree that Jesus said that he's the Son of Man from Daniel.
Let's let Samuel finish.
Okay, go ahead, Samuel.
I'm saying that when we assess Jesus, we do it with two fronts. We look at it historically, as I've shown. We also do it in terms of the Old Testament, because the scholars do say that Jesus was a Jew who saw himself in that Old Testament role. And so he did see himself as the Son of Man and the things that come with that. So this is why we assess Jesus historically. And so historically, but also theologically in terms of the prophecies. And so my question for you is, you were saying that the Old Testament influenced the New Testament, and so that the New Testament writers are just making up a story. You're trying to, write it off by saying they're just making up a story by going back into the Old Testament. The point is, if that's the case, then how could God ever fulfill his prophecies? If the Messiah is to do these things, then he's going to have to come and do them. So when Jesus gets on the donkey and comes into Jerusalem as part of his messianic role, did Jesus actually do that? Or is it just that the apostles just made it up and put Jesus on a donkey? Because I think you're going to find most historians will say, no, Jesus was doing these things deliberately from the Old Testament to show who he was. They might say he failed in what he did, sure, but that's what he thought he was doing. So that's my point. So this is my question. Is it right to say that the New Testament writers are simply taking the Old Testament? Aren't you denying the fulfillment of prophecy?
Okay, first of all, Samuel, it is not true that most historians think that Jesus actually saw himself as fulfilling whatever was mentioned in the Old Testament. Second, historians generally believe that the New Testament writers, or at least the early Christian community, and their conclusion is now reflected in the New Testament writings, the early Christian community and the New Testament writers thought that Jesus fulfilled things in the Old Testament, even things that were not actually prophecy. And then they wrote the stories about Jesus to reflect that expectation. Read the book Gospel Fictions by Randall Helms.
That's not my question. No, that's not my question. What I'm saying is, if you take that skeptical view, then Jesus can't fulfill anything, right? The view you've taken is there is no God, there is no prophecy. If Jesus fulfills something, the church has just invented a fulfillment. I'm saying maybe he was the Messiah. Maybe he did do these things because he's fulfilling them.
Okay, so you don't have to be an atheist. You don't have to deny the possibility of prophecy. You just have to read the Old Testament in its context and see that they were not actually prophecies. You mentioned Isaiah 53. It was not a prophecy of somebody to come later on. It is a story about the Jewish people at the time and the struggles that they were going through. We were talking about the virginal conception.
Sorry, before we have loads of points there, Daniel Boyarin gives evidence from the Targums, from the Talmud, and from, who was the other guy? He gives all the Jewish examples where they do. The traditional Islamic view is that it is the Messiah.
Well,
Isaiah 53 is traditionally understood as the Messiah in traditional Islam. Traditional Judaism.
Okay, no, traditional Judaism does not accept that Jesus is the Messiah. There might have been conceptions that the Messiah is spoken about in Isaiah 53. Daniel Boyarin is not universally acknowledged as valid in everything that he's saying. I invite you also to read Paul Schaeffer's book. What is this book? Let me see if I can go back to Schaeffer's book that I had on my screen. Peter Schaeffer, his book entitled Two Gods in Heaven. So these writers are saying, okay, some people took Daniel 7 to mean that there are two gods, an older God and a younger God. And of course, the New Testament writers are trying to portray, some of them at least, Jesus as that younger God. But then you have two gods, and this is not monotheism. They didn't quite work it out. How is that monotheism? And Christians eventually arrived at the doctrine of the Trinity to defend monotheism, despite the fact that they took a younger God, and now they have the older Father and the younger Son. So the point of all of this is that the Old Testament was not necessarily predicting Jesus. Even though we believe in Jesus, we don't have to believe that the Old Testament predicted him. Even though we believe that in the virgin birth, and the Quran does not deny the virgin birth, we don't have to believe that the Old Testament predicted him. So when somebody says Isaiah 7:14 is a reference to Jesus, it's not a reference to any future person. It's a reference to a person in the court of Ahaziah at that time. So it's a court of Ahaz. So it's not about the futuristic event to happen 700 years later. But the New Testament writers wrote about Jesus riding on a donkey, as demonstrated by Randall Helms in his book Gospel Fictions. He shows how the writers took the exact words from the Old Testament and they included that in their narratives to depict Jesus as the one riding on the donkey. Okay. But it wasn't a prophecy about Jesus at all.
Well, it is a prophecy from Zechariah about Israel's king coming. And so my point is, if you take the Gospel Fictions or whatever the name of that book was, then you end up with Jesus not fulfilling any prophecies, not doing anything, not even coming as a religious figure. I mean, why wouldn't he come fulfilling Zechariah, where it says the Messiah will come this way? Why wouldn't he come that way on a donkey? Why wouldn't he? Why does it have to be a fiction? It seems that you've just made up your mind that, no, I'm just rejecting it and I'm not going to accept anything.
Well, even if we can accept that Jesus is the Messiah, we do believe Jesus is the Messiah, and even if we accept that this prophecy from Zechariah is about the Messiah to come, Jesus does not fulfill the role of a king. So he could be a Messiah without being king. He could be a prophet Messiah. He can be a priestly Messiah. In fact, the idea that he was crucified counts against the gospel narratives, because the gospel narratives present him as a king, and then he fails to be a king. And then the Christians say, okay, but he will be a king when he comes back. And the Jewish people are saying, well, okay, when he comes back and proves himself to be the king, then we'll accept him. But in the meantime, it looks like he failed to be the king that he proclaimed himself to be. But we would say that, no, he was not a failure. He did not proclaim himself to be king. Nowhere in the Quran does he do that. He is the Messiah, and Messiah can be priest and prophet. If he is king, as the Gospels portray him, riding on a donkey to fulfill Zechariah, then he failed to be the king that he said he was going to be. Well, and he was
Samuel, one point, the Zechariah 12:10. On this. Just can I end with the Zechariah 12:10? It speaks about the Jewish understanding is a future kind of Moshiach ben Joseph in battle. Not crucifixion, and a lot of them would point out that he didn't fulfill as yet a messianic role for peace. So some scholars, some apologists would say that this would be in his second coming. So as it stands, then that would be an unfulfilled prophecy as yet until his second coming. So you can't attempt to recontextualize the text and fit it to Christ when it
I'm
hasn't
not
yet
recontextualizing it. I'm saying that I'm saying that any example we give you, you just write off. any example of fulfillment, you just write off and say, oh, it's a fiction. And I'm saying, well, Jesus does nothing then. You know, there is no fulfillment of God. He comes as the resurrection king, the king who is bringing the resurrection from the dead.
Yeah, but in a future battle, at the Battle of Armageddon, where Israel mourns the slain leader, the Moshiach ben Joseph.
We're out of time. We're out of time.
Yeah, we're gonna move into the closing statements or arguments now. We've gone just over 28 minutes. Thank you, gentlemen, for a very engaging cross-examination time. Just a reminder that we're reversing the order for the closing statements. So it will be Rudolph, Yusuf, Samuel, and Shabir. So each speaker has 4 minutes each, and I'm going to hand over to you, Rudolph, for your 4 minutes.
Well, thank you, friends. It's a lively discussion because we are passionate about this topic. But I just want to say at the heart of this discussion, it's not simply a comparison between two religious texts. It is a question of identity. And after all the arguments, after we look at all the sources, dates, manuscripts, traditions, and everything ultimately that we discussed, it comes down to one question. And this is a question that Jesus himself asks in the Gospel of Matthew. He turns to his disciples and he says the following: who do men say I am? The answer came quickly. Some said John the Baptist, others said Elijah, still others said Jeremiah or one of the prophets. In other words, he's a prophet, a messenger, a great religious figure. That answer sounds very familiar because it's precisely the portrait that the Quran gives us of Isa. But Jesus did not stop there. He pressed the question even further in verse 15. And he says to his disciples, but who do you say I am? And listen to Peter's answer. Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is in verse 16. This motion and moment is crucial because Jesus does not correct Peter in this narrative. He does not rebuke him for blasphemy. He does not say, no, I'm only a prophet. He does not say anything, but blessed are you, for flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. That is found in Matthew 16:17. So this exchange matters because it tells us something decisive. And like I said, and Samuel have shown, we can see quite clearly that the New Testament will show that Jesus accepted worship. He affirmed his divine sonship. He made claims unique to his divine authority given to him from God, all within the first century Jewish framework, where such claims were either valid or blasphemous, but never natural. And it brings us back to this debate. The Quran answers Jesus' first question, who do men say I am? But it refuses to answer the second. My Muslim friends today agree that the Quran gives us a Jesus shaped by more than 7th century theology. He's also a construct of apocalyptic legends, Gnostic substitutions, and later polemics. A Jesus who does miracles drawn from the rejected infancy gospels, who avoids crucifixion despite universal historical testimony, and who speaks with categories foreign to 1st century Judaism, but well known to Gnosticism. By contrast, we see that the New Testament gives us an early Jesus. The Jesus, as Samuel have shown, the Jesus of the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, the Jesus who proclaimed the divinity of himself to his earliest followers, the Jesus whose death and resurrection were preached within years, not centuries, of the actual events themselves. This is why, and Samuel made a statement, historians, but most historians, Christians, Jewish and secular, consistently conclude that the Quran contributes no independent historical data about the Jesus of Nazareth. So the real question before us is not, is Jesus important? Both sides agree that he is. The real question is, which Jesus stands on the firm ground of sound witness and testimony and history? And as I've shown, and as Samuel have shown, a Jesus known through the eyewitness testimony, early creeds, hostile corroboration, and Jewish context, the Jesus that we find in the first before the first 6 centuries, we see that Jesus is the sure Jesus. The Jesus of the 6th century onwards and the 7th century onwards, he is definitely simply an argument. We can see who he actually was in history. Without the Gospels, without the surety of the Gospels, we can know nothing about the historical Jesus. And when all the evidence is weighed, the answer that emerged historically, textually, and coherently is not the Quranic Isa, but the biblical Jesus. Even the biblical Jesus tonight was used, in some instances, was used to describe for us the Quranic Jesus. So let me just say, This is exactly what we see. We can see quite clearly that Jesus is the confessed Savior, Christ the Son of the living God, as he revealed himself in the text. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rudolph. I'm going to move to Yusuf for your 4 minutes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the spirit of discussion. I think Rudolph made an interesting point earlier in his closing statement where he said that the Qur'anic Jesus is an argument. And he's actually right. It is an argument, but it's an argument fundamentally against the idea that a man can somehow or the other be God. And that's the essential point, is that the Quran emphasizes strict monotheism, asserting that God has no partners and no offspring itself. So from the perspective of the more rational person as to who the actual Jesus is, that actually reflects the internal logic presented within the Quran itself. In Islamic theology, the rationality lies in the concept of a single, indivisible God as a central tenet of Islam, which views the idea of a divine son or a triune God as contrary to this unity. Jesus is presented as a human messenger who experienced human needs, which is a rational argument against his divinity within the Quranic framework. The Adam analogy, the Quran uses the creation of Adam without a father as a parallel to Jesus' birth, arguing that if a unique birth made Jesus divine, Adam would have a greater claim, which is dismissed in both cases. And so that would present a logical argument against attributing divinity solely based on miraculous origin. When you comb all the passages of the Quran in relation to Jesus, they're not biographical accounts on his life. And the Quran never makes the point of being a biography or a hagiography as the Gospels would about the life of Jesus. So you can't critique the Quran in relation to Jesus from a historical critical method. But you can, on the other hand, do that with the Gospels, because the Gospels do pretend to be biographies or, in fact, hagiographies in relation to who Jesus is. And so, when, for example, Rudolph proclaimed the point that Peter called, Jesus the Messiah, the Son of the living God, ho Christos, ho Hios, to zontos in Matthew 16:16 as a proclamation. You find the same narrative, the same incident recanted in Mark, the earlier gospel. And in that instance, he just simply says, ho Petros lege auto se ho Christos, you are the Christ. So why the critical point, Messiah, Son of the living God, is left out by Matthew in that specific narrative? I don't think you can explain it away. I gave it the demonstrations about the rebuke in relation to the storm, and of course the lack of prayer on the part of John in Jesus's part during the advent of the crucifixion, or the story of the fig tree in relation to the ignorance of the season. I don't think you can wish this away. Essentially, it basically points out to the idea that these stories were not really biographies, but more particularly narratives to substantiate certain particular theological motifs that these particular writers were writing to their different communities, whoever these particular writers were. Because, the reality of the situation is that, generally speaking, all of them, as the late Didat would say, are according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to Mark, and according to John. And scholarly consensus is on our side. We're not trying to be funny here, but the scholarly consensus is on our side in relation to the anonymity of these particular books. So if anyone has a problem as to who is the accurate Jesus, from the Quranic point of view, Jesus is not a spectacular individual. He's presented as an enhanced prophet, as Shabir Ali basically mentioned, as a mighty messenger of God, as an individual who did miracles, which is, in a sense, confirmed in the gospel accounts. But be that as it may, there is no biography which you can essentially critique to say, look, this never happened. It is, as Rudolph had stated, an argument, but an argument to take a corrective approach. So when you look at the aspects of the crucifixion, when the Quran denounces the crucifixion, it's not necessarily making a corrective approach in relation to a historical position, but it's actually taking a corrective approach with regards to a theological position, that from a Christian point of view, Jesus' death is a necessity, and it's necessary because of his death, he will basically redeem humanity of its sins. He's an atonement. So the Quran takes a position in relation to that and denounces that for a particular theological reason, which is that nobody can die for the sins of humanity. And I think my time is up. I leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Yusuf. We'll move on to Samuel for your closing argument of 4 minutes. You need to go off mute, Samuel.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a lively discussion. And you've given me 1 point to think about and go away. And so that's always a good thing. To conclude, let me just get my points up here. I just want to give a bit of a summary as to what we've done. I was looking at, so I looked at the fact that there are different views about Jesus in the world. There's the Christian view, the Muslim view, the Baha'i view, and other views. And that the way that we should determine what is true is to look at it from a historical and theological point of view. Historical in terms of the normal tools of history, but also theological to see that Jesus was a Jew in that story of the Old Testament and, you know, being the Messiah and what that meant. And so there are those two aspects to look at. The New Testament itself, we've seen, is made up of many different witnesses from his disciples. This is actually what Jesus himself commissioned. He commissioned disciples fulfilling Israel's mission to be a witness to the world. Because there are these different ones, there are differences, as we've discussed today, that you've got to work through. But that's the nature of any eyewitness material. You've just got to work that through. These are the earliest documents. We saw that the teachings and narrative of Jesus can be seen in a fixed form no later than 17 years after his death and resurrection, and that it confirms the previous scriptures about the resurrection, about the Messiah bringing the resurrection kingdom and bringing atonement. I also brought up Daniel Boyarin, who said that the ideas of a divine Son of God predate Christianity. And so the idea that we can say that these stories of Jesus come from a development and later, Daniel Boyarin says, no, you can't say that. You can't say that. These ideas were there already. I've seen that the Bible is confirmed by history. We looked at I referred to Josephus and a whole range of others, which confirm the biblical account of John the Baptist, Jesus' brother, Jesus and his life. And many people like Herod and all the other characters that we see in the Bible, we see also recorded in Josephus, and this is confirmed. And so historians actually use the New Testament as a historical document. You can go and read the Oxford and Cambridge history of the ancient world, and they are regularly referring to the Bible. I even showed an example of where the Quran in Surah 5 talks about Christian judging by the gospel. And so that's what we're commanded to do. And also I showed from Ibn Ishaq where the Gospel of John is specifically named and identified as a source that you can refer to prove Muhammad, therefore endorsing it itself. I was a little surprised at Shabir and Yusuf saying that the Quran sort of isn't this historical stories about Jesus. I don't think I've misheard you there, but that it's actually just taking up the stories that we're told. And so my understanding there is that it is more of a theological engagement rather than a historical engagement. I think Yusuf actually said that it can't be judged historically. And so I just want to say that the Quran, if that's the case, it's not even claiming to give genuine history. It's not claiming to give history. It's claiming to give an engagement with the theological ideas of the time. And so for that reason, I want to encourage people, if you want to know the historical Jesus, you need to begin with the gospel accounts in the New Testament. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Samuel. We're going to conclude with Dr. Shabir. Dr. Shabir, you've got 4 minutes in your closing statement.
Yeah, gentlemen, it's been wonderful having this dialogue with you, and obviously we need to do more of it in the future, and I'd love to do that. Let me engage with some of the points that have been presented today. As you will recall, I tried to see what the historians generally agree on, and I identified 2 major points on which they agree. One is that Jesus was a Jew, and 2, that Jesus was crucified under the Roman authorities. Now, why are these 2 points important for weighing both the Quran and the Bible in the portraits that present of Jesus? First, that Jesus was a Jew. This means that he did not teach the doctrine of the atonement, the doctrine of his blood sacrifice for the sins of people. And whereas the Bible presents him in that way, the Bible actually contradicts one of the hallmarks of history regarding Jesus. And Jesus kept the law as a Jewish person. The Bible seems to be ambivalent about the law, resulting in the New Testament teaching that Christians do not need to keep the law. And this is how Christianity has evolved, with some kind of ambiguity as to whether to keep the law or not keep the law, at least the 10 Commandments or the penal laws. Christians generally don't know what to do really about the law. So that comes from the New Testament, that has actually garbled the story of Jesus and tried to present him as a non-Jew, almost as a Greek and Roman who do not have the Jewish laws. Although also the idea that he was a Jew meant that he would not have claimed to be a divine being coming out of the heavens, as presented in John's Gospel, in Pauline writings, and in the Hebrew writings and Book of Revelation. So what this means then is that even if Daniel Byron is correct, and there was this idea of an older God and a younger God, as depicted in the book of Daniel, that doesn't mean that Jesus himself claimed to be that. But rather, what we can see is that when the Gospels are lined up one after another, and we see when they were written, with Mark written first, Rudolph mentioned Mark on priority, and then Matthew and Luke coming later, and John even later still, we see that the story develops where Jesus is made bigger and greater. So whereas in Mark's Gospel, he's proclaimed to be the Messiah, in Matthew's Gospel coming later, Matthew, using Mark as his source, adds Son of the Living God, which Rudolph quoted at the end, to my surprise, because I thought Yusuf already made that point, and I'm surprised to see him bringing it up. So the Quran is showing that this development took Jesus from a man to a God, and the Quran is bringing us back to the real Jesus, not the actual events in his life. That, from the Quranic perspective, is not important. The Quran is concerned with the theology, and it's more important to get the man right than to get the specific events in his biography correct. And so the question is, what do these events, whether they're in the canonical Gospels or non-canonical Gospels, mean for Jesus as a person? How should we conceive of it? Should we conceive of him as a Jewish prophet who kept the law and did not die for the sins of the world, or somebody who abrogated the law altogether? The Quran says he only abrogated some things, but he kept the law as a whole. Jesus, on whom be peace, is shown in the Quran to be a faithful servant of God, worshiping God. And we've seen that John was ambivalent about whether Jesus would, in fact, Jesus said that he would not pray like that to be saved from the cross, even though at other points, even in John's Gospel, Jesus is praying to the Father and declaring him to be the only God. The Quran saying, judged by the Gospels, I think we already discounted that in our previous debate, so I'm surprised it comes up again. But what the Quran is saying is judged by that which God has revealed therein, not necessarily by all of the gospel. So I'm glad that we had this discussion. In short, Jesus, on whom be peace, is in the Quran, is close to that historical reconstruction, at least in maintaining that Jesus was a Jew. And the Quran has a thing about the crucifixion which some people have objected to, but I've shown that if the Quran is understood as only denying that Jesus died on the cross, then the Quran is on this point in harmony with the historical conclusion, and also at many points with the Gospels. So thank you all very much. Good to be able to speak with you again. Peace be with you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir. I want to take this opportunity to thank each of our speakers. So firstly, Rudolph, thank you very much for all your preparation and for joining so early. And to Yusuf as well, thank you for joining so early in the morning from South Africa. Thank you, Samuel, for joining from Australia.
That's fine.
Yep. And Dr. Shabir, thanks for staying up so late in Canada.
Okay, no, it's been my pleasure. And by the way, your dad was mentioned in the course of this dialogue, and that brings back fond memories. May God have mercy on him and bless you all.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for a great and respectful discussion, and also to everyone online who joined today. I wish each of you a good day or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thanks for joining. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Who knows?
Cheers.